Uh, let's see here.
Oh my God.
Yeah. All right. So
Okay.
we're good. We're back. All right. So I could restart the whole thing
All
maybe.
right. Let's.
But in any case, you got to love the technical glitches going on there. Tonight, we are going deep into Edgar Cayce Saves the 21st Century Earth Changes Crisis in World Affairs Prophecy. And we're doing it through the figure of Edgar Cayce, who, in his readings on Atlantis, projected out into 21st century America and did that incredible back and forth connecting. So we're going to get into that tonight because it's crucial. And there's some very interesting things that are kind of left on the cutting room floor whenever it comes to the Cayce work, which we're going to get into tonight as well. Now, we do have of course, the Trump indictment and the mugshot. I'm going to ask you for your opinion on that shot again. It's really something
Okay.
else, isn't it?
It's the best ever.
I would agree. And this is interesting to me because, what happens here is they were trying to, and this boomeranged on them terribly, I think. The whole plan was if Trump comes across as a criminal, if he has a mugshot, there's no way that he could win the Republican nomination. And of course, he's 40 points up. There's no way for them to stop this guy. So they're just throwing every kind of spaghetti at the wall to get him. But that's not all going to work. And that's the nature of what they're doing. So now the next thing that we hear is building up is over in Arizona. They're going to try the same thing. And Jack Smith is pulling out what little hair he has in order to try to figure out a way to make that J6 case stick on the federal level. Of course, that's a ridiculous charge. So all the things that they're doing with Trump, very interestingly, are putting him really in the populist bullseye. So the picture, of course, will be legendary for them ever getting to a point of indicting a president, and especially for the things that they're throwing at Trump, which are completely ridiculous. But this is the way that I see that shot. Really, what that makes Trump is the 2024 winner. And that's the kind of boomerang and the kind of populist overturn of the election that will happen in 2024, throwing out the Biden regime. Now, there are some wild cards in the mix, and I'm going to get into those tonight too, relating to RFK Jr. So we're going to get very deeply into that. And of course, that was Trump, very relaxed coming into Atlanta. And I saw him in interviews, the Tucker Carlson interview, and also heard him in some others. There's something going on here because, of course, he is Teflon Don and nothing tends to stick to him. But he has kind of a preternatural calm going into these proceedings that I find very interesting and I feel relates directly to the advanced technology level that they know he has access to. And I don't mean that as some kind of, hocus pocus 5D chess thing. I literally have laid out the case here. Trump, in his family background, has access to that advanced technology. And that's part of the peeling his opponents off the ceiling, because that structure feels like his very presence is a danger to them. So, Democrat, Republican, Green Party, whatever you are, no presidential candidate should be hounded by his opponent who he's losing. So if your opponent is losing as the president that's prosecuting you, that's a banana republic straight up. And the Biden administration, that regime with Stepford Biden at the top, needs to be removed. And the methods through the election can happen. I know there's a lot of discouragement because of the last election, but they won't be able to pull without the full-on COVID op. They won't be able to pull that this time. So it's going to be very tricky for them to pull off the same type of nightmare election as they did last time. Of course, as I mentioned, these other 19 people, or including Trump, 19, are charged in the Georgia case. Interesting to me that it was 19 hijackers in the 9/11. So I think that they're doing their own reference there and upset that Trump has brought these things to the fore. But I'll tell you, they just gave a tremendous boost. And then Trump actually tweeted out, you're not going to hear me say X for that platform. He tweeted out his own mugshot. That's the way to do it. That's his first tweet since he left office. So quite remarkable as well, considering he has his own platform there. But that thing got a tremendous response and earned him 500,000 new followers to make him right in the top 5 of people followed in the entire world on any platform. So this is really remarkable and shows the actual populist strength, as opposed to Biden, who has institutional people looking out for him, but on the surface has about a 35% approval rating. One of the things I've pointed out and why they need the emergency powers so very badly is what's been happening here is that the people, Justin Trudeau is a really good example, 29% approval rate. These people don't have enough popularity to govern, which is why they resort to emergency powers like the COVID op, like the trucker emergency, all these types of things, like Macron in France. So what we're looking at is the use of emergency powers, and how do you really get emergency powers? Well, we've laid out a very heavy case here for the continuity of government, and they are just switching over that leader. Now, at the end of August, we're going to get the new leader. Van Herk is out. Mr. Roswell is out. And now we have a new guy, and he also has a very big UFO crossover. But we'll get into him later. That's General Gillett. But it is interesting that they're switching him because, as we know, Van Herk has only been in there since August of 2020. So that's a pretty short run for those guys. And that's a triple threat. Remember that it's NORAD and NORTHCOM, and then he's also the COG combatant commander. So it's the same position, gets all three roles. Quite fascinating indeed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Yes, deep tonight, we are going into Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet, and Edgar Cayce saves the 21st century. There's a reason why I put an emphasis on that in this episode, because there's so much information that came forward from Cayce that we can glean from his over 14,000 readings. And we know that there's more out there, but those are the ones that we have access to. And in fact, when we look at the Cayce work, we are looking at someone who spent a good deal of time looking at world affairs through World War I, through World War II, and gave us an outline of things to come. And Cayce just having that incredible vision across time, looking back in a retrocognitive fashion back to Atlantis and Lemuria and the whole move into the Incas and the Mayas, and how this worked with the intense technology that the Atlanteans had. This is another major piece that Cayce brought forward that really wasn't articulated very well anywhere, which is the actual high-tech level that the scientists of Atlantis had that caused the great destruction there. So this becomes a very important piece for us as New Atlantis in America here. So we're going to get into that tonight. Cayce taking a tremendous chance going into all this mysticism. After all, he was a Sunday school teacher and came from a very religious community in Kentucky, then moving on to Virginia Beach. And he was hounded by religious people, who heard about his unusual readings and strange things, and the fact that he made reincarnation a central tenet of the mystical work that he was bringing forward, and in fact was accessing the past lives of the people who were coming to him to get the Atlantis readings. So there's some 900 life readings and multiple readings linking back to Atlantis, including his own, and his very important incarnation as the priest Rata, which we're going to get into tonight, because that opens up all sorts of doors as the Atlantean-Egypt connection happens directly through this figure of Rata in that period. So psychic experience, life after death, reincarnation, the lost continent of Atlantis, advanced technology. This, 2 hours is not enough to contain this special report, but we'll do our best and cover a little bit on the UFO track with election 2024. Before I go any further, everyone, it's up to Miss Olivia to tell us how everything's going out there.
Good. Wendy Edish says, I hope DJ is going to talk about Edgar Cayce's predictions about Russia in the future.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, it figures into it. There's not a whole lot there, but what he did say is quite fascinating, because he indicates on several occasions that Russia will become the hope of the world. Now, this is very interesting. And when you really drill it down, it's relating directly through spiritual movements that arise in Russia. One of the things that Rudolf Steiner mentioned in relation to Russia is that they had a very special mystical tradition. And he described it in very cosmic terms, that on the ethereal plane, the kind of root race of the Russians hadn't come fully down into materiality yet. So they still had access to these kind of mystical realms. And that's where so much from Blavatsky to Gurdjieff and everything else comes out of this area, Ouspensky, And I mean, Gurdjieff was an Armenian Greek, but he spent all this time in Russia cultivating the Fourth Way movement. So there's something very special there. And of course, there are references all the way through the Cayce readings to Rudolf Steiner's work, to Ouspensky's work, to Gurdjieff's work. This is very important because the crossover of the mystery schools working in tandem, who are not even in a situation where they're meeting each other. There's a certain point where Cayce's giving a reading, and he gives this very unusual philosophy about the fourth dimension. And then he says, this is Ouspensky giving us this here directly. The only problem with that is Ouspensky's still alive. So people expect, oh, I'm channeling, something from some long, William Shakespeare or something, some long lost historical figure. No, Ouspensky is channeling it to Cayce while he's alive. So, there's a lot of crossover here. Of course, Cayce saying that Steiner's work on Atlantis and Lemuria was, in fact, the Cosmic Memory book was, in fact, him gleaming it directly from the Akashic records. And so, that ability to tap in, these people recognizing each other. And of course, Steiner coming directly out of Theosophy and the work of Madame Blavatsky. And Helena Blavatsky's work coming forward in 1875, bringing in Atlantis. And then suddenly we have the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, who is running for president, and so there's all these things that happen in this period. And it is, as we've said here, the mystery schools coming out and saying we need to provide some kind of a block against the scientific materialism that's taking over everywhere. And, so we run across this often with people who are holding records or holding secrets, that there's divisions about how to do things. And in the case of the mystery schools, there was a small group, but a very pronounced group, who decided we have to let this stuff out because in a century or so, we're not even going to recognize humanity. And there were a lot of unusual things that happened when they let out so much of this, like the spiritualism craze of the 1860s. Finally, the whole compromise was reached, and Blavatsky was the person that was presented, but they found her to be kind of out of control and not somebody that they felt would keep their secrets. So, after she let out this incredible Isis Unveiled book, which had secrets which had never been released in public before, suddenly they decided we're gonna put the block on this. And one of the things that Steiner said is they decided that they were going to work through someone else. And he doesn't indicate that it's him. He was building anthroposophy in his movement. My impression is that many of the Western mystery schools decided that Edgar Cayce was the figure because of this past life as Rata, that when he came in, he would be the person that they would bring these truths forward with. And it's not often mentioned. I got this directly from Harmon Brough, who worked with Cayce. And it's the late Harmon Brough now. He's passed away, but he talked to me all about, and he went on record about this, lectured about it, included it in his book, about this turbaned figure that would show up at unusual times in Cayce's lives and during Cayce's lifetime in very stressful situations. And I think is a crucial thing if we want to understand what was going on with Cayce and his incredible role in bringing this information forward. And what was the information relating to the 21st century? Well, pole shifts, land rising, earth changes, consciousness raising. I mean, it was really forecasting something rather dramatic. And I think that even the group now that holds the Cayce records, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which I think has extraordinary people working there. But I think that institution, since its founding, was afraid of the things that Cayce said in relation to Atlantis, that they were too controversial, because there's remarkable information in there. And where did that all come from? So it's much easier, in a sense, as an organization, I think, just to say, well, Cayce has this dramatic thing. He's the father of holistic medicine, and, develop your psychic ability and things like that. But Atlantis and the high-tech Atlantis, especially that Cayce envisioned, is remarkable and really changes our version of history. So I think that they look at that, and they have for years, and been like, there's not much we can do with that. So I think they've shied away from some of the really hardcore things. Here are a few examples. In Atlantis, according to Cayce, they had developed technology through something called a TUAOI Stone, which was a multifaceted crystal power station throughout the entire continent, which existed on one side of the ocean at the Gulf of Mexico, and on the other side of the ocean, the Mediterranean. And that's the same area mass past the Mediterranean Sea that Plato indicated in his famous account. So we have a lot to suggest that Atlantis was right there in the Atlantic. Now, there's been a lot of people who've found it in the South Seas or found it in Peru or whatever. Atlantis, for what it is, in the mystery school tradition, in so much of the research that we've been able to find, existed right here in this Atlantic Ocean as a huge continent. And what Cayce tells us is that they developed a kind of a death ray technology to basically use against these gigantic beasts that were overwhelming the island and the continent. And what happened was they tuned it too high. And as a result of that, the first major destruction of Atlantis into 3 islands happened. The islands were called Arion, Og, and Poseidia. And Poseidia Island was the one where the Amelius group, who had intended to use the technology for very positive purposes and spiritual purposes of communing with the outer spheres, the saintly realm, and things of this nature, they were using the TUAOI crystal information for this. That whole group that operated in Poseidia, that group was where we now locate the island of Bimini, and in that hot zone area that we've discussed so much in this program. And for sure, when the X series comes back in the fall, we are doing some very, very interesting hot zone episodes. As a matter of fact, they're trying to institute all these things in Cuba to make it, a CBDC pilot program where everyone has to give up their cash and be under this digital system. That's part of the control of the hot zone, and there's no question that China has a military presence there now. So we're seeing some very dangerous things, as we always have. Anytime you get into the hot zone, there's a surface layer of the political tensions. But if you go even a little bit deep, you start to become aware of a number of how the ancient ruins aspect and how that type of archaeology, the archaeology wars, plays into this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a very special report we're doing here. Edgar Cayce Saves the 21st Century. I'm going to switch gears just briefly so we can do a couple of things on this 2024 election. Before I do that, I want to remind you that we are taking your questions in the second half of tonight's broadcast. So we'll do that in about an hour or so. And you can ask those questions all in caps. Miss Olivia is taking them right now. You can ask them anytime, and she will put them together in order. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Shane Boydston says, do you think Cayce is alive now, considering he said he'd reincarnate about at this time? I know he might be slightly later, as I don't remember the exact time he gave.
Edgar Cayce indicated in a reading that he would be reincarnated in 1998. And what happened was you had a lot of bozos show up when Cayce became popular and say, I'm Edgar Cayce reincarnated. And finally, Gaia TV really promoted the hell out of Wilcock, who was doing this total sham. And it's unfortunate that, there's all kinds of marketing things that they did with that guy and all of the, super soldier BS. And we know that all those people ended up in court with each other and a bunch of nonsense. But what's interesting, I think, when you get into this is that in terms of the actual nature of all this, Cayce had pinpointed 1998 as the pivotal change. That was the time when things had gone into a different direction. And you'll find people who, have lived through and are a little older telling us, things feel different than they did, say, in the 1980s. And, going back to my parents' generation and the things that they were talking about, there was a sense there that was very different about what the world was going into. There were challenges, yes, but there was some hope that we were achieving something. There was going to be a space age, there was going to be all of this automation that was going to help human beings not have to do the daily toil and kind of move on to other things. Instead, what they've done is they've taken those advances in technology and try to figure out how to depopulate. This is not something that people from that generation really envisioned. And so Casey is putting this in other terms, saying that there's a great showdown that's happening on a spiritual level that is manifesting again in reality as it did in Atlantis at the end, and that these are the Atlanteans reincarnating. I have some very interesting readings to take some of these themes with, but they have come back to face off in this battle. And so this is going to be very important for us to understand the Atlanteans are back, and many of us are Atlanteans after all. So we're facing up one way or another. And he identified the two groups in that period as the sons of Belial, misusing the advanced technology and the kind of black magic aspect of Atlantis, versus the Amelia's group and the Law of One Amelia's group. Now, the Amelia's group was coming from a position of using the advanced technology, as I mentioned, for interaction with spiritual realms. So the idea of basically open your laptop and commune with an ascended master, I mean, that's what they were training it for. And the Belial group said, aha, their laser beams come out of this thing. And so they imitated the Amelia's group. This is the story that arises. They infiltrated and imitated the Amelia's group, and slowly but surely in government and otherwise took over the technology and made things into kind of the Frankenstein state that the end of Atlantis was, when finally the TUAOI stone was misused on too many different occasions. But on one particular occasion, it caused a massive upheaval and destruction. And the area where it was misused was in the war between the Amelia's group and the Sons of Belial. That area where it took place is right where the hot zone crosses over into the Bermuda Triangle. And over again, we hear those stories of people with compasses spinning backwards. I've gone through a number of those accounts, and those are people who understand the sea, and they understand the kind of oceanic science very, very well, including Jacques Cousteau. And, this is still something that we don't quite understand what it was that took place there, but the level of it endangered humanity to such a point that all that technology went underground. And that's when the X steganography was kicked off by the mystery schools, all the way back, and goes all the way back to the Book of the Dead. And now we see X is back. As we've been telling you, this is coming up. And the X steganography was readopted again in the 20th century to hide the advanced technology. Interestingly enough, they had the formula set, pat, and ready. So this gets very interesting. Now, I'm going to switch gears and jump into the 2024 election briefly, because I've been seeing a trend which is very important, I think, and plays into some of this. Of course, Casey did a lot of political readings, a lot of things on world affairs, and talked about the crisis in world affairs going through World War II, the Depression, World War I. He was very aware socially of what was going on there. But what he saw for us in the 21st century was a choice between, like Steiner, this scientific materialism that would just take over, the kind of might is right thing, with one group consolidating power. And he said if there was ever revolution in America, it would come between the forces of capital and the forces of labor. And if you translate that, you see that as this gigantic technological state versus the populace and the populism. Now, the technology aspect is easy to demonize, but it's very important for us to be able to apprehend this. I spent a good deal of time over a decade being the editor of a technology magazine. So it was, I'm so deep in there with so many technology people that, there's no technology that I'm allergic to. And I wouldn't suggest anyone become a Luddite and abandon the technology. The idea is that the misuse of the technology is what we're looking at en masse. And that goes to Jeff Bezos, that goes to Zuckerberg, that goes to Musk. That whole group that's consolidating to make a kind of corporate superstate has nothing to do with the kind of democratic republic ideals that this nation was founded on. Let's get a couple of things on the record, because somebody who's really exposed a great deal of this is RFK Jr. And of course, his dad and his uncle, John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy was in the midst of the exact same battle versus these forces. And now, anyone who is in that media needs to target people like RFK Jr. and take them down. Well, one of the great things that RFK Jr. has done is educate people so much. And I don't think that the independent media has quite got around enough to bringing in, really getting behind RFK Jr. in this fight. And I suggest it highly because he's proven himself, and he, from his fights with Monsanto to taking on the COVID op, this is somebody with incredible courage, and, he has the background of courage there. But even just on his own, without the incredible family background, the Kennedy Camelot, which really saved the world. If you look at President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, these people who fought for justice and the ideals of justice in American society, they leave an echo, and their deaths haunt us here in the 21st century, because there's very clearly the government never owned up to who assassinated them, but that group is still in charge, and that forms part of the problem that we're looking at here. What do you got there?
I got tons of questions. You could actually skip the presentation completely and just field questions about Atlantis and Cayce. There are so many coming in.
Oh, that's funny. Well, maybe we'll do a two-parter eventually.
Mm-hmm.
But we have some good things, and I'm glad there are some good questions. Why don't you go ahead and throw me one out?
THP33 says, does Cayce give a time frame when that tragic event occurred?
Well, the Earth changes, and when they're kicking off, it's very interesting because he talks about how the Earth changed its position in 1936. That's the original sort of move. And you see that incredible rise of Hitler in that period, and World War II coming up quickly. So whatever the strain is on humanity there, it seems related dramatically to this shift in the Earth's balance. Now, when he's visioning forward, so many people were talking about disasters, year 2000 and all that. Cayce didn't see it this way. He saw Earth changes coming, but he said it was going to be a gradual process. And this is interesting because that's what we're looking at. But he determined that 1998 was the year, the kind of cutoff year between the old way and the new kind of position that we occupy. And he did indicate that from 2000 to 2001, the poles were shifting, but he didn't say you're going to be inundated, it's the end of the world and that kind of stuff. And I think there's a lot of misreading in the 60s and 70s around Cayce, trying to make him a prophet of doom and the herald of the paperback book. There's a classic book from that period called The Late Great Planet Earth, which was a huge bestseller. And I think the group just running the marketing on the Cayce side were like, hey, Cayce gave these prophecies that were like that. Let's put him out there like that. But it's not actually the case. He does talk about disasters. And yes, it's true. He talks about California going beneath the waves. And we'll talk to you about some of those changes. But let's get a little bit of business done on this 2024 election. RFK Jr. is someone who has proven himself in this, and I think deserves the support of anyone looking for a better America. Now, the campaign that he's run so far, where he's made himself available and really tackled so many issues, shows the incredible brilliance of this guy. The thing that I would say, and I like to get in the huddle with the people that I want to be in the political arena, and I've said this in coaching the Trump campaign and coaching the RFK Jr. campaign. Here's my advice, okay? The first thing that I kicked off with a few months ago was embrace the UFO file. They're going to use it. We've seen that they're going to use it. and you have to show your wisdom on the subject, background on the subject, and there's no time for holding back around the UFO file. That's crucial. It came up during the Republicans' debate, if you can call it that. They had Chris Christie there. It was like, please. But some of the people on stage there, they gave him the question, which I thought was an odd choice, and he made fun of it. He was like, "Ha ha! I guess I'm from New Jersey. I have to get the UFO question." And
what the hell does that mean?
Good point. It is interesting though, and I think that some people performed pretty badly, like DeSantis, for example. Nikki Haley showed she was a hardcore neocon. But the person who did pretty well was Vivek. And I want to contrast this with the RFK campaign. Vivek did a couple of things I think were important. And it's not that I think Vivek would make a great candidate, but he showed himself in that situation to be very canny. And this is someone who's campaigning for the presidency. That's very important too. You have to remember you're going for the top job. It can't be a gloves off, affair. You have to present the policies that you want to bring forward. And the problem is if your opponent is dragging the world into a third world war, if your opponent is attempting to curtail the rights of American citizens to free speech, if your opponent is trying to rip up the Constitution, then you can't go about the campaign in a regular fashion where you say, I'm not going to be negative on my opponent. It doesn't work that way. In order to save America, you're going to have to take down the opposition. That's all you can do with the Biden regime. It's a sick regime. And, we're going to have to take the Alzheimer's patient there and remove him from office, because what's going on is he's being manipulated by a committee in the background because there's nothing going on upstairs. That's the truth of the matter. You need to point out the fact, yes, and you do a great job, Mr. Kennedy, in relation to this. You do a fantastic job of pointing out the incredible waste in Ukraine, including the fact that we're looking at 600,000 casualties, but profits galore for Lockheed Martin. This is the kind of sick situation that the neocons have put us in. But you can't get the Biden regime out by not engaging with him directly and saying it's his fault. He's the responsible officer of the governor of the government, and as a result, he needs to be removed, and it has to happen yesterday. So there's going to have to be some strange, completely change, a huge change in relation to how Kennedy is doing this if he's going to win. Now, if you wanted to just go out there and be a protest candidate, that would be one thing. But RFK Jr. can win. He can win the Democratic nomination. He could win the presidency. But he is going to have to take on Biden. There's no question about it. Biden has destroyed lives. He's walking around making jokes about his Corvette in Maui as thousands of people have lost their homes and thousands of people have died. I mean, you're not going to be able to do this in a lighthearted fashion. And, all your interviews are very serious. The issues very, very well. You are going to have to take down the Biden regime. The way that you do that is to take your opponent, President Biden, and to show his flaws and get in his face and say, this is your responsibility. You're the responsible officer of the government, and therefore this is on you. That's why people should vote for me and remove you from office. It's going to have to get there, and there can't be, it can't go any lighter than that. So anyone who's giving you advice in the background not to look like a bad guy, look, the media is already tearing the Kennedy campaign down. They're already going after this guy. There's no way that they're going to accept the Kennedy campaign. But the Kennedy campaign has the force of history behind it. And the Biden administration is incredibly vulnerable. And they have somebody up there who doesn't know how to tie his shoes, and they have a committee running him in the back. Expose it. Expose who's running it in the back. And you're going to find Barack Obama in the back running that campaign and running that presidency. So we need to remove that phony apparatus, and we need to go in for the real thing. This is crucial. And let me tell you, when you stack up Bobby Kennedy next to Biden, we would have a completely different world. Bobby Kennedy is that good that he can take out the this incredible threat to democracy. And I think at the ballot box, he can win. And I think instead of what we will have if he doesn't do it,
Oh,
we're going to have this, little puppet out there getting us into World War III and saying, well, we got into World War III, couldn't be helped because of that Putin. This is where he's going. And when they talk to this guy, he's just not all there. I mean, he's had a number of sort of brain stalling out moments, and we've seen him just be completely inarticulate. Let me tell you, our friends and our allies and our enemies around the globe are looking at this guy and saying, America is going to be easy to sucker punch. And this is the nature of why we can't do it. We cannot allow the Biden regime to reclaim another 4 years in office, because whoever is running that is going to become emboldened. So the RFK Jr. Campaign is, in a way, our only hope on the Democrat side to do anything. He needs to seize the initiative in relation to there. I hope he's listening tonight, because he has all the articulation, he has the support, but he has got to really show people that he wants to remove Biden, and that in this sense, because Biden's destroying the country, it is personal and he needs to be removed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Edgar Cayce Saves the 21st Century. Boy, I'm telling you, we're deep into it with the UFO campaign of 2024, but RFK Jr. is going to play a huge role in all of this, and he can summon up the spirit of Camelot, which is right there with him. He just needs to really, bring it on like RFK brought it on for LBJ. And don't hold back, because there's no, whoever is in that campaign saying try to be polite or something, forget about it. I mean, now is the time to take the gloves off, and it has to start here. So I hope someone over there is listening, and because otherwise it's a great campaign, and he's a fantastic candidate with the force of history behind him. Last week we talked about the UFO file as the crucial issue in the campaign. This has been going on since RFK Jr.'s uncle, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated over the UFO file. This aspect applies to the assassination that they're doing legally to President Trump. We're in the middle of this situation. If Robert Kennedy, as he ran John F. Kennedy's campaign, he gave him advice in relation to Nixon's attacks on him, as, Nixon saying he's a playboy, he's too young, he can't do it. And Robert Kennedy was getting advice from Joseph Kennedy, the dad, who was saying, go after Nixon. Don't let him get away with that. And so Robert Kennedy devised a series of speeches for John Kennedy. And some of those lines are hilarious, where he relates Nixon basically to an elephant's ass, which I thought was pretty good, because the Republicans had the elephant as their symbol. And in his speeches, he started to include this idea. He said, look at Nixon. If you go to the circus, what do elephants do? They grab the tail of the elephant in front of them. And so, there was a whole thing about him coming out and really starting to swing at Nixon. And this helped his campaign dramatically. And RFK knew, as the campaign manager, that they had to, show themselves to be professional in the debates and show themselves to be very articulate on all the issues, which JFK was. And that shocked the Nixon campaign, the level and the depth of knowledge that he had about these things. But he also knew that he had to take off the gloves when he was campaigning. And if you go back and you look at some of those things, you're going to see, you'll also find that in interviews, after Kennedy was assassinated, RFK is saying that LBJ is an animal who eats people up, so he's putting it on the record. And I think this is the kind of thing that Bobby needs to do now. There's no time for Mr. Nice Guy on this. You're going to have to demonstrate just how evil the Biden regime is, and the things that they're doing, and how the very world is at stake. It's not, you're saving the country. So it's not a negative campaign. It's not that's not the nature of it. It is just, you have to show those flaws in order to take the country back. So I'm counting on them to do that. And I want to say this in relation to Trump. Trump is showing himself to be a very canny person, the way that he's dealing with all this. But the effort by the deep state to remove Trump shows the depths to which they'll go. They floated an article in the New York Times, I kid you not, about the fact that we shouldn't have elections anymore because we could get another Trump, or we could get Trump back. That's how these people are thinking. So there's an illness.
So let's destroy our entire way of life here.
Exactly. That's the nature of the illness in the establishment right now. So we just have to be very straight and honest about it. Look, there's a number of channels legally that Republican Congress can really get off their butt on this one and go after Fani Willis, who is misusing her office there. And there has been talk about this happening. Also, they have found now her making comments about how she thought the election was stolen, that Trump stole the election previously. So according to her own indictment, she'd be under indictment. It doesn't make any sense. Also, her campaign manager, who made all these negative comments about Trump, as soon as those were revealed by Breitbart, the campaign manager locked their Twitter account. That's a bad sign. But Breitbart already had the stuff. But, these people know that they're being used as an arm. They're being weaponized as part of the Department of Justice, quote unquote. And it's the Biden Department of Justice prosecuting his opposition. That's what you do in a banana republic. So is America a banana republic, or are we a democratic republic? That's going to be the question really on the ballot. Everything else, Gavin Newsom, who's supposedly the replacement for Stepford Biden, if anything should happen, it's very interesting because he moved to the state assembly of California that Trump should be removed from the ballot because, he doesn't think that Trump lives up to the moral certitude that you need to run for president. I mean, you can't make random decisions like that, just like he wanted to call martial law during the COVID op. So you have these insane people. You're going to have to draw the line in the sand as voters and stop them legally, stop them at the ballot box, stop them, on social media, call your local legislature, whatever it happens to be. That wave against these people is going to be major for 2024. That's what we have coming up. So the battle is joined. And there we are right in the middle of it. Miss Olivia, what do you got over there?
THP3 Free says, RFK Jr. has no Secret Service protection. What will stop assassination?
Exactly. And, Bobby articulated this very well. He said every other candidate, Herman Cain, remember Herman Cain?
Yeah.
999, Herman Cain. This guy who had a pizza chain and was running for president and had 6% in the polls or something. He had Secret Service protection. This is outrageous. And it is the Homeland Security Director, Mayorkas, who put the kibosh on that on orders from Stepford Biden. So Biden doesn't want RFK Jr. to have that protection. So think of how sick that is. Just remember that,
I don't understand how that's legal.
Well, there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of loopholes, and they're using a very old loophole that says you only have to do it 6 months before the campaign, but that's never been used before because after Robert Kennedy was assassinated, they started granting Secret Service coverage to anyone who was up there in the polls. And over and over again, we've seen the Secret Service, the strangeness about this. So they're already security stripping RFK Jr. That's happening at the behest of the thing that is running Biden. So that's what you're up against. And my advice is expose it and don't hold back, and people will love you for it. And for those people, I think, out there, I've pointed this out, there's kind of a purist snobbery going on in the independent media world saying, well, 15 years ago, RFK Jr. said this one thing. I think he's put himself out there. He's been very transparent. And, it's not one or two issues that are going to determine this. It's not, are you going Republican or are you going Democrat? This is to save the country. You're going to need the best candidate. And I don't think we can have this whole thing about when I get it over and over again from people. My message on this is simple and make your own decision. But, if someone is going to save the constitutional republic of America. It's going to be someone who respects that. And certainly Kennedy has not only that pedigree through his family, but through his own efforts exposing Monsanto, the COVID op, Fauci. I mean, that book on Fauci shows just how well RFK Jr. understands the government. So we have to get in on this and get behind this guy, and he needs to fire it up against Biden. If those two things happen, then look, this could really be an incredible race where he could unseat Biden. That's important. If he takes it easy and the independent media is like, well, he's not perfect, so therefore we're not going to do anything. And I keep hearing this thing like, oh, presidential elections doesn't matter. I wonder if that's the Biden administration feeding that directly into the independent space. That's my guess, actually, because presidential elections do matter. And whoever put that out there was wrong, totally wrong. So in this case, the election couldn't be more important because you have a body politic, and at the head of that body politic is the president of the United States. We need a good president, and you cannot have the Biden committee and the Biden regime running this because they will run us right off into Armageddon. I don't think there's any doubt about it because the neocons are fundamentally insane. This is what defines them. And they're running the liberals now the way they used to run the Bush Republicans. They run both sides. They'll switch over. As soon as they get what they want on one side, they'll turn into like Ayatollah-style conservatives, and they'll take the very same people that they're creating these voter groups for, this whole trans thing that they're pushing. Trans people don't want to be used as a political football, and they'll take those very same people and go after them. So think about this. This is what's going to be going on. They will use any side of it. It is very much like 1984, where the party decides what the past and the present is all about and who the enemies are. And we've seen them switching up dramatically. But I think when it comes to the campaign moves that we've been seeing, them prosecuting Trump, stripping RFK Jr. of his Secret Service detail, the stakes are too high for America. So politically, we have to be engaged. And this is a wake-up call also for the independent community. Having some kind of purist idea about some super pure candidate who can come out, who's not associated with some subject that you don't like, or hasn't taken some position which you're not going to be crazy about. That's not the way to choose the president this time, because by that lackluster support, we'll lose the presidency to the Biden regime. What can happen instead is the incredibly weak Biden regime can fall under the weight of the truth. And all we need to do is get that message out, because they have the advantage, they have the establishment, they have the media, but we have our independent voice. And so this is going to be very important. And by the way, the UFO file is going to come right in the middle of that 2024 campaign. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Edgar Cayce Saves the 21st Century. Earth changes. Wow. Crisis in world affairs, prophecy. Just extraordinary, the gift that we have of the Cayce work. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program, and you can ask those questions of Miss Olivia now. She's putting them together. How's it going out there?
Good. Jules wants to know, what are DJ's thoughts on the possibility that whoever is running things in the background instituting martial law and stopping the elections?
Well, it's the deep state. And what they're building up to is that they don't want any election. They want it to be a continuity of government election if they're in this much trouble. However, I think they would run the election if they thought that Trump could somehow be disqualified from a key state, that they would work in a corrupt fashion behind the scenes. Now, that's totally illegal, and it would be the trigger for a large-scale protest movement if it hasn't already. But we've seen the kind of dirty moves, and I think the playbook that's going on in the background for the deep state is no one will ever be ready for how dirty we can be. That's the playbook, and that's a CIA playbook. And they've worked it out in everything from assassinations and the planned assassination of Julian Assange, which Trump stopped, remember, that our own CIA was planning. And also, in relation to every area that they're infiltrating, including the UFO file, which is why we've gone on such deep record in relation to that, the CIA is sitting there using the entire UFO issue, which has been, really grown organically among a number of different groups, and they've come in and invaded that. They have a great reason for doing this, and we're going to get into that as well, as looking forward into this 2024 campaign. All the reports that we do are going to center on the fact that you've got Trump out there being prosecuted by the deep state. You have the Biden regime trying to keep Bobby marginalized, calling him fringe, and also the DNC disrespecting him, Homeland Security stripping his Secret Service detail, all of these different things. That'll be happening. But in the heart of it, you're going to have this whole piece about the UFO file. And the UFO file is going to be brought forward in the middle of all this for the cultivation of a UFO threat to trigger an emergency powers situation if they feel they can't control the election coming up. Remember, they almost called COG in October of 2020 when they thought Trump was unbeatable. And they decided, well, the mail-in ballot situation, we can work it that way. That's really what happened there. And if you look at the chart of how mail-in ballots were used in that election, on a scale never, ever seen, ever. And remember when the elections used to be, like a one-day affair, and you'd know by 10 o'clock at night who won? Now they're like, well, elections can go on for weeks. Don't worry about it. This is just how democracy works. No, it isn't. It's how Dominion voting systems work. That's very, very different. So prepare for more election 2024 reports. We'll get them to you. We have some important key contacts in relation to that, interviews, all kinds of things coming up on that front. For the rest of tonight, we're going to explore the prophecies of Edgar Cayce and how they relate to the 21st century and the situation we're in. How are you doing out there?
Good. I don't know if Casey said anything about this, but I definitely want to ask you this question. John Beppu says, has DJ ever talked about the Deagle 2025 predictions?
Yeah. Who really has brought those forward is our good friend Alexandra Bruce over at Forbidden Knowledge TV. She pointed them out to me in an interview that we did together in 2016. So she was on top of that way before anybody. And in fact, everyone was wondering, why does Deagle, who does these kind of, projections of things, and military leaders and all kinds of industry groups pick up on their numbers, why would they be talking about that type of depopulation? What were they expecting? And nobody knew what was going on at the time. But of course, the COVID op was the first indication of what was happening there. Now, I don't attach thing to any particular date when it comes to predictions or projections. I've been hearing this John Ramirez CIA guy come out, and he's the former quote unquote CIA agent. And this guy talks about, oh, I was an abductee. This is their new thing, right? Semivan, he's an abductee. Gary Nolan is an abductee. Beware the CIA abductee. That's the way I look at that one. But in any case, he came out and he said, it's all shaping up for disclosure in 2027, watch out. So they've been threading all these things out there. And what we learn, if there's any kind of honest journalism that goes on in relation to the UFO field, is there's all this behind the scenes shenanigans going on. And so let's say that, for example, a group like Elizondo and Mellon came forward with the false CIA whistleblower thing. And, we as a lonely outpost went through the actual record of this guy and, saw the op for what it was, put it out there. And then 5 years later, all this information is coming out. Information is coming out now about Mellon and Elizondo and how Mellon manipulated the Defense Department not to go after Elizondo. Those emails just came out today. And he said, he's using this stuff saying, well, he has a History Channel show and he'll fight with you guys. He'll openly show this stuff if you don't go along with this idea of him being this phony UFO leader. So, there's a lot of things that come out over time, and then people just think, oh, well, we found out these things. There's a 5-year timeline of the manipulation since 2017. It's now 6 years. And that manipulation, which we've pointed out early, what happens is there's a wave, and the audience and the readership and the whole kind of media world catches up. But the problem is we can't afford to lose those 5 years in between. So that's the whole point about dark journalism. That's the point about the X series, which is we're tuning into this, and if things are ahead of their time, and if we have the jump on it, as we've proven over and over again on a number of these subjects, and not just us, I'm just pointing us out as one example here in the work that we do in dark journalism. But we can't afford that 5-year waiting period where things come out. So, things can't take too long. So if we've put it forward about the UFO threat, the continuity of government link, then there should be a much greater investigation around this. There's only so much control that we have about how that works and how the things that we put out there. A lot of people are picking them up, but they're picking them up in a haphazard fashion. I'm going to show you a really great example, and it's no diss to any researcher or anybody else, especially since I'm not familiar with the guy's work at all. But I'm going to show you a deep state character who's been wandering in through these different independent media places, and under the guise of, oh, hey, psychedelic mushrooms and UFOs. But this is a former W. Bush official. And, she's been laying the groundwork for World War III with aliens. I kid you not. The UFO threat is alive and well. I have a little section on her here, and I'll get into her much deeper in a separate report. But of course, this is Pippa Malmgren. And Pippa, of course, she's a distinguished woman, and if she ever wants to come on this program to discuss her ideas, that's fine with me. But she has a background as a special assistant to President Bush. Okay, so the Bushes, as we know, the architects of the deep state, very, very deep in there. So here she is putting out all these posts in relation to the UFO file. She goes, I explain why, now, and how this story of UFOs has become real. It happened through bipartisan legislation and modern sensors triangulating on anomalous phenomena. First of all, we've had modern sensors looking at UFOs since 1947 and collectively ever since, including all the upgrades when we got satellites and everything else. It didn't just happen that we upgraded our sensors. Now we can see those evil UFOs. But anyway, let's keep going. Thanks to brave pilots and intelligence officers, and David Grush, who won the Pentagon support in his whistleblowing, who the Pentagon supports in his whistleblowing efforts. So remember about Grush and all the things, the reports that we did, and him coming out July 26th in front of Congress and saying, like, I know where aliens are in the skiff. Well, look, we've shown his background with the NRO and all of the people who are training him at NGA. That's all CIA. Those are all CIA trainers. And so this guy was a big piece of that CIA UFO operation. Now, Grush is interesting because his story fell apart rather dramatically on certain levels about his own personal competency. And what's interesting is she compliments him, Chris Mellon, and Senator Gillibrand here. I think that's very interesting and tells you where they are connecting the dots. She goes, to be clear, the burden of proof is not on Dave Grush or even on the Pentagon now. It's on those accused of failing to comply with the legislation that now requires all branches of government to hand over everything on this subject. This explains the recent NASA Pentagon statement. We've got nothing, but it may be that the parties in the institution are withholding information from their bosses. And I'll tell you what's happening here, which is you get intelligence officials, you get former government people, you get Bush people. And remember, Grush, his lawyer, and the guy who was sitting behind him telling him what to say at the congressional hearing, that guy was the chief legal spook. He was the inspector general of the intelligence community. That's who we're talking about here. So that's the nature of the people. And his mentor was James Clapper. So that's who you're dealing with around the UFO file and Grush and that whole thing. This is the nature of the thing we've been able to bring forward. But here's Pippa saying that Grush, doesn't have the burden of proof, and that they're creating this dynamic where these insiders are saying that government has to give us the truth. And that, the CIA is like, oh, the government has to give us the truth. The CIA is the government. Pippa is the government. Elizondo is the government. Grush is the government. So this is a false thing. So they've created a false paradigm based on analysis. The analysis was people do want the truth about the UFO file, and they want the government to give it up. But what they want to do is say, well, the people they're going to give it up to are the ones who are holding the UFO file. They're going to create their own narrative around this, and they're going to create these intelligence agents and government insiders pretending to be whistleblowers. I've got a classic example of that here. This is great. I love this one. This now is Jim Semivan. Jim Semivan, top, and I mean top CIA official for 25 years, and also in the directorate. So, that's the highest level you have. Here's what he says. And remember, he founded TTSA and put out Tom DeLonge as the Bobo for this thing. I don't care what anybody says. It, the UFO file, is the story of the millennia, and it needs to be talked about. To the Stars VP and co-founder, there he is, Mr. CIA, Semivan. Hey, guess what? He also is an abductee. Isn't that incredible? Gee, it just so happens. The CIA is so great, they just want to give the public the truth about the UFO file, and they're fighting the government for it. It's fantastic. What a reality we live in. That's the kind of UFO dribble that you're getting. And what's interesting about this for me is watching how they work it through the media channels. And you get whole stations like News Nation who are, basically laid out there in exactly for this operation. They're basically created for it. So it's a very interesting situation. But Pippa is particularly unusual because of her Bush affiliation. And now she's out there on the circuit. And like I said, I'm not saying anything. I'm sure she's doing this for somebody. And, she has a distinguished background as the Council on Foreign Relations, all of this kind of stuff. But this is not somebody that I want to trust with the truth about the UFO file at all. The Bushes? Are you kidding me? So here's what she puts out now. This is the voice of truth for UFOs, right? George W. Bush. Disclosure gains momentum as Major John Olson, Space Force, DoD, says UAPs are a global phenomena and now under international collaborative study. I wrote about this in July, the space anomalous phenomena. And so here she is putting out the UAP word. So Pippa here was on a popular podcast recently. This guy does all kinds of stuff with celebrities and I think ayahuasca and stuff like that. Are we already in World War III? It's happening in space, under the oceans, and in the economy. Now, whoever produces this guy's show or the host of the show watches this show and borrows a lot of the themes for, they just pick up the idea of the UFO file, the threat, COG, the black budget, all these types of things. And that's fine. But the problem is they don't take them in on a depth level. They're just doing a kind of a superficial glance at the thing. And then when they run this through the shows, the intelligence officials lead them down a garden path and have them promoting the UFO threat. In fact, this episode is called Has World War III Already Begun? UFOs, UAPs, Space Warfare. And it's this guy, Aubrey Marcus. Who would you call him it's like a coach to the stars kind of thing?
That's pretty good.
And, I'm sure he's a nice guy. I've never talked with him or listened to his show, but I can tell you this from the show with Pippa. She led him down a garden path because he doesn't know in depth about the issues that are being discussed. And so he picks up some things, or his producer picks up some things from a show like mine, for example, and then they just run with it, but there's no depth. So they can't see when the CIA is leading them over the cliff. This has happened. I've pointed it out in relation to Megyn Kelly. Tucker Carlson took on all the Elizondo people and all the phony CIA people pretending to be whistleblowers. This is the nature of the problem, which is these people don't know anything about the UFO file, really, and they are going smack into a Central Intelligence Agency UFO threat operation. And they think they're getting disclosure. So, hey, I'm being hip, and Tucker Carlson comes out and says, hey, we talk about everything, even the UFO file, right? But look, Tucker, if you have CIA people coming on your show giving you the truth, quote unquote, That's not the same thing. That's not real disclosure. That's CIA disclosure, which is a circus disclosure. It has nothing to do with actual UFO file disclosure. Those are two totally separate things. And I always like to make the joke that somebody asked me what my favorite Joe Rogan alien show was. And I said, he's never done a show on aliens or the UFO file. And I, it may not be literal. There may be some shows, but the point is this: those are CIA people, or the whole op piece, the marketing op, the opsters, Corbell, Lazar, all that stuff. That's not the real UFO file. So there's marketing ops, there's intel ops, and sometimes those are one and the same. So we need to learn to differentiate, and just calling something the UFO piece doesn't mean anything if it doesn't have the instant understanding that the CIA and its counterintelligence branch are going to lie to every American and every global citizen because they don't want to share the UFO truth that they've been hiding for 75 years. Why would they? Doesn't make any sense. Think about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight on Edgar Cayce saves the 21st century. Earth changes, crisis, and world affairs prophecy. We've covered now the UFO file and election 2024, and there's more to come on that. But now I'm going to switch back to the Edgar Cayce story.
Sounds good.
So, Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good. Again, I've got lots of questions if you want to start fielding them.
Please do.
Let's start with the TUAOI Stone, because everybody loves that. Okay, so Martin K. O'Connor says, what kinds of things were the Atlanteans powering with these TUAOI stones? And Gamma says, the TUAOI Stone or crystal? Maybe we already have it. The internet, I see, you see, silicon and quartz computer clocks.
No question. And that whole piece comes back. This is what's interesting, in my opinion, which is Casey's calling what we're doing a rediscovery. And when I read some of the reading excerpts, that really comes into focus. I'm going to get into the TUAOI, so I'm going to actually save the depth on both questions because there's a whole section here on TUAOI. How are we doing on time here? Okay, this is how we'll do it. So, Rata. Let's start with this. Rata was a priest, an Amelius group priest in ancient Egypt, who planned out, according to Edgar Cayce, the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the entire Giza plateau. Now, interestingly enough, he sets the date for this occurrence at 10,500 BC. Traditional dating around the pyramid of the Sphinx is 2,500 BC max. So you've got 8,000 years of difference there right off the bat. But here's an even more interesting twist, which is when Cayce gets into it, what does he say? He says, in fact, they were doing archaeology. Rata, Hermes, and the whole group that laid out the pyramids. They knew that that spot had already been used as a very sacred location, and that is where they were going to place the Hall of Records and the Giza plateau and the pyramids, the Great Pyramid. So, in other words, this site goes back much further. So you have the Cayce saying the Sphinx and the pyramid, 10,500 BC. Traditional archaeology, 8,000 years different. And then Cayce saying, no, it's even older because the people who are making it there in 10,500 BC are doing archaeology to find it. Now, there's also unusual things in the Cayce record about Rata, which is he becomes an Atlantean priest, but he's actually from the Carpathia region and Iran and that whole stretch there in the mountains. And he comes down with a group of 900 and they take over Egypt. And then through his visions, he is seeing that Egypt is going to be the central hub of these Atlanteans. And then he goes to Poseidon and the Atlantean priests correlate with him how they're going to do the Hall of Records and everything else. This is the figure. And of course, the artist we've pointed out before, Nanette Christ, absolutely fascinating and really captures the essence here of Rata. More on her coming up. But here's what we have about Rata. He's unusual. As a matter of fact, at a certain point, it appears that Cayce says he doesn't have an earthly father, depending on how you read it. let's figure that one out. But anyway, here's directly from the reading, Edgar Cayce. Yes, we have the entity in those conditions or records that are apparent in the inner self or the entity of the body at present from that scene and recorded as Rata, the priest. In giving the interpretation, we must find there are many peoples, even nations, that were influenced by the material activities of this entity in that experience. The entity came into the land of Egypt with others and had come for a purpose as evidenced by that which has been given. He came with people from that region that was later to be the earthly sojourn of the entity as a leader. The entity chose, rather, the peoples that were to enter into the land and was the son of a daughter of Zu that was not begotten of man. So instantly, Rata's unusual because either the suggestion there is Rata himself is not begotten of man or that his mother was not. So something is unusual. There's a difference here. So he may be Nephilim. He may be an off-world visitor. But whatever he is, he's not begotten of man. He could be a spiritual conception. Something is unusual about Rata right away. And Zu, and a daughter of Zu, there's some unusual things about Zu that come up in the readings. But let's keep going. In the entrance, then, he came rather as one that was rejected by the people about him. Forever there has been the question, or such has been the experience among peoples who had formed any associations of home. Home, as may be remembered, began with the peoples in an entirely different land and was then projected in thought by those various leaders in those places where man as man had come into being through that crystallization of thought that had been given by the sons of the Most High in Atlantis. So there's a whole thing that's referenced there about Emilius coming and seeing this kind of disastrous situation that was going on with humanity being trapped in materiality, and that there were scientists in that period that were trapping the souls in these forms that sound like early cyborgs mixed with animals. And what happens is Emilius decides what we're going to do is we're going to project a pure line, and we are going to do that as the center in Atlantis. And in Atlantis, they do this. And what happens is the Belial group in Atlantis decides, well, this is becoming a threat, but also it's quite remarkable because how are they making this whole different line of people? So this gets very deep because the period that we're talking about, Emilius is supposedly the first person who separated himself into male and female. Before that, you have a kind of a unisex androgyne. So when he comes in and does this, the Belial group hangs around long enough to imitate what's going on there. They try to get into the process and figure out what's going on. And Emilius later gets described rather mysteriously by Cayce as Adam. So he will say Emilius, 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 and then he'll say Emilius as Adam, as if once he splits into Adam and Eve, he becomes a different being. But Emilius comes in and comes through in order to, he comes down from the higher realms to sort things out, to sort out the human situation and this incredible thing that's gone on where the early Atlanteans have delved into what they call the night side arts. Now, basically what we have going on from there is that Emilius sets up a group that observes a leadership that comes in from what Cayce calls the saintly realm. And it's interesting because at a certain point, they start to master all of the elements around them in a way that is not trapping them in matter. And so the Belial group trapped in matter, and they are utilizing the elements. But the Emilius group is utilizing the elements, but they are not becoming trapped in the elements. So this is a very important distinction between the two groups. And the way that this history plays out is eventually the Belial group and the sons of Belial will initiate a total takeover of the Emilius group, and they will infiltrate it and they will steal their secrets, etc. So, and they'll use the same abilities that the Emilius group is using to attune on a spiritual level for very physical means. This is the origin of this battle between the Belial group and the Emilius group in the heart of the Cayce readings. And at times you'll hear about this Law of One group, Sons of the Law of One. That is the Belial group. And what happened was later, after the Cayce readings came out talking about this Emilius group and the way that they would call themselves Law of One, in the 70s and 80s, there was a whole channeling thing that came out, which had, some dubious origins, but if some people liked it, whatever. But unfortunately, that got glommed on. So when people hear Law of One, they don't realize it's a totally different thing than what Cayce was talking about with the Emilius group. So I think it's important to make that distinction. So now let's go back to the readings and find out what Cayce says is happening here with Rata in relation to Egypt and saving the Hall of Records that the Atlanteans developed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is a special report, Edgar Cayce Saves the 21st Century, and I'm going to get into those earth changes and the pole shift and the land rising aspects that are going on. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. You can ask Miss Olivia those already. She already has some good ones. We're going to start taking them here in the next, say, 15 minutes or so. So we'll do our best. I want to remind you before we go any further, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch. We've had remarkable censorship going on such a regular basis that we're just used to it at this point. But the best way around all that is to get the direct back and forth link. And basically, it takes a minute to sign up, and you can go to darkjournalist.com right now and do that. And you'll get just a newsletter once a week letting you know about the amazing shows that we have coming up for you this fall. Interviews, documentaries, and the X series, the return of the X series in the fall with remarkable episodes, just mind-blowing stuff relating to the Hot Zone, the UFO file, and Apotheum. You're going to want to hear about all of it. It's all there on the newsletter, and it's free, so make sure you stand up and be counted. Now, we're going to go back here into Cayce, and Cayce traveling through time, looking back at this lifetime as the priest Rata in Egypt. And Rata and his development and his reincarnations become a very important thread to follow, as Cayce will lay out some rather dramatic things about this character in space and time. So we've already got that Rata wasn't necessarily then human. He's part of something else, but he has a human mother. And so he talks about the earth changes that are taking place at this time, the preparations that happen, and how Rata is locked in with this Atlantean network of initiates, and how they instantly start to say, how can we save the people? How can we save the technology? Where can we place the records before, Atlantis is wiped out? And this becomes a worldwide effort at that time. And they're utilizing advanced technology, airships, and the TUAOI Stone. Now, the TUAOI Stone was the power station that got knocked out on a number of occasions. At one point, as I said, it split the continent into islands. On another portion of time, it actually sinks. It causes the final destruction of Atlantis. But just before that happened is the snapshot, is this opening of the story of Rata as given to us by Edgar Cayce in the trance state. In this period, then, there was the prophecy by Rata that the son of Arat was to journey into this land of Egypt, where there was then the higher state of development as to the necessities and those abilities to enjoy the activities of the mental and material bodies and their associated actions. These brought then those things that were classed in the present as pleasures that gratify the senses of man's own development. For much that is now as the developments that are the necessities as well as luxuries were then commonplace as the most common necessities in the present. Hence, to those peoples, while Rata was still looked at with suspicion and the removal of the peoples into the Egyptian land during that age of Rata, it would be called today 1 score and 1. Then the entity gave much in the way of aiding those peoples, the children of Ararat and the families of Sem. So what happens is Ra goes in with this group of 900 people, and they say to the Egyptians, we offer you all these things. We're more advanced than you are. We're going to we want to have a co-government with you. And the king there says, I want to avoid bloodshed. I'll work with you, and we'll upgrade this culture. And then Ra starts to go back and forth between Atlantis and Egypt. Then we have this little interesting snippet here. It says, with Ra then beginning with the natives and those that listened to the uncovering of the records in what would be termed archaeological research in the present, gradually more and more adherence was made to those words of this peculiar leader that had come into this land. So he comes into Egypt and he does archaeology on the Giza Plateau, and they find records there. So before there's a hall of records that they place there, they go there and realize, oh, there already is one. So this is an ideal place for us to place ours. What they had there and what they learned there is very interesting. And when we get into root races, and when they say things of this nature, that we have these different root races, there's nothing, this isn't relating to a racial aspect. So this is very different when they talk about that. And when they talk about Ra as the pure white, they're speaking of his aura. That is, he has this nobility, and that's the attribution here, although that might be misused now. In this condition, then, the wonders of the activity of Ra brought forward conditions that were the source of disorder, dissension, and discouragement to the activities through the whole period of experience, because basically it turned out that in Egypt, conditions were pretty bad. And so he's coming in with this higher peace, and the Atlanteans are joining. And what's happening is, little by little, they're turning into kind of balkanizing the situation with groups that are turning against each other. And what I think is interesting when we get into further ideas about Ra is that he is looking out at this situation and realizing, oh, there's going to be a massive destruction of Atlantis. We need to work to preserve that. And so he goes to work with an entity who is a priest in Egypt, from Atlantis, who becomes a priest in Egypt, and together they lay out the Giza Plateau. So the individual is Hermes, who is also very unusual. And if you look in history, he's associated as this wisdom figure, but it is Hermes and Ra who lay out the pyramids in Cayce's story. And what happens is, parts of Atlantis are sinking, and so there's a huge egress of migrants who come in to Egypt that are Atlanteans. And what they do is, with all of the natives there, the Atlanteans come in with all these automatons. And the automatons are basically like Atlantean cyborgs that they've created. And what happens is, Cayce outlines the idea that the Atlanteans instantly think of the native population of Egypt as, hey, look, more fodder for automatons, more slaves for us. And this causes the majority of the tension that's going on there in Egypt. And I think it's interesting for us to think about Cayce spinning this story, because if you go into automatons and the way that he's identifying this, now Cayce's speaking in the 1920s. Basically, he's talking about cyborgs and robots, and the term for them at the time was automatons. If you go back and look at examples, I found some, this figure, which writes, is actually from 1805. And that is a multitasking automaton who can sketch, write, and do a number of unusual things from 1805. Here, a little bit later, this one is even more complex. These are the automatons. So when Cayce is saying Atlantean automatons, he is relating directly to these Atlantean cyborgs. This is the language that they have. The term robot is not really in full parlance yet. It's out there, but automaton is more of the reference. This is the term that Cayce uses. Now, what happens is, I mentioned this about the organization of the ARE, which is, they were afraid of what Cayce was talking about. They were like, oh my God, he's talking about cyborgs, Atlantean cyborgs. So what they decided to do was, well, it sounds enough like the Greek myth stuff. It sounds enough like the merging of, half man, half animal, that we'll just say that's the part that we're comfortable with, and that there were, the Atlanteans had these half man, half animal things. And it's true that they used, uh, the Atlantean scientists used this and created these half animal figures, but they were creating, since they were mixing human with animal with cyborg, they were creating this mix which human souls could get trapped in. And so the goal of Rata, with all of these things that the Atlanteans were bringing in, was to take them to something called Temple Beautiful and remove the aspects over a generation of the cyborg animal influence and create the human part and let that through, because these souls had incarnated into these forms. And so that's the whole kind of Frankenstein aspect of what the Atlanteans were doing for slave labor. And so Cayce's story is really, you can see in a way why the organization shied away from it. And what happened was Cayce's son, Edgar Evans, who I got to meet and who in his 90s looked like a guy who was in his 60s, which is remarkable. And that's Edgar there with the astrology. It was very kind of fascinating because his book, and he was an engineer, so he understood things about what the Atlanteans had, and he had been a reincarnated Atlantean as well, according to Cayce. But he understood basically how an advanced civilization could get up to that point, destroy themselves, and then have to start back in this way, in this fashion. You saw this repeated in things like Planet of the Apes and all these other themes later. The Cayce and the Steiner work have influenced more scripts, everything from Star Trek to Twin Peaks, and often uncredited, I can tell you, from picking up on it and knowing the literature. And so what we're getting there is that Cayce's saying, here's the big struggle that's going on. And in fact, what Rata is doing is he's trying to realign the DNA of these things. And the Atlanteans have a huge trove of them. And the thing is that the Atlanteans, wherever they go, have a large group. And Cayce refers to them as automatons, things, untouchables, whatever it would happen to be. And he said, well, this is basically how they use them. They use them for laborers. They use them as artisans, and all the different things that they could do. So they had their little kind of clone cyborg army. The only problem was the humanity was projecting into these things. And how would they get out? They'd be trapped in this whole process. So this is a very deep story that Cayce is giving us on this. Remember that Cayce had proved himself dramatically in trance doing medical readings. And that's why he's no ordinary psychic in this sense, because not only could he go back and get this kind of information or project into the future, but he also could get medical information. There was a story about Cayce from 1910 in the New York Times that got him his first kind of wave of publicity, which is, and the way that it happened is very interesting too, because Cayce was selling insurance with his dad, and he lost his voice. Now, he'd had a number of very unusual psychic experiences, including the fact that his grandfather, who he's very close to, died in a horse accident when he was 5 years old, and he watched him drown, couldn't do anything about it. But after this terrible incident, the uncle, very interestingly, would come and visit with him so he could see his deceased grandfather, excuse me. And it's very interesting too, because the grandfather, if you go back into that history and you read about him, he could do unusual psychic things. That is, he could lift objects, he could lift tables and things like that by looking at them. So already there's a thread there with Cayce, and it's very unusual too, because the father of Cayce doesn't seem to have any of those abilities, but the grandfather had them in spades. And I find that very interesting. But the early conversing with someone who had passed beyond is a sign right away for Cayce that something extra is going on. Later, he'll have a number of unseen companions, and so much so that he's thought of as a freak or, psychologically challenged in that era. We're talking about Kentucky and, growing up in the early 1900s. So we're looking with Cayce at someone who did an extraordinary amount of verified psychic work, and he could go and give the most erudite prescriptions and things. When people came to him for medical readings, the doctor would say, "Where are you getting this from? Because this is incredibly advanced stuff." And a number of people thought the people who were, going to him for readings, that they thought they were dealing with a doctor. The doctors would think they were dealing with another doctor. And Cayce never pretended to be a doctor. He said, "I'm going into the psychic trance state to help them through this information." So he would eventually be called the father of holistic medicine for this very fact. And if you look, there's a number of things, kind of the foundation of the Cayce legend is largely based on his incredible medical readings. So we need to keep that in mind when we have some idea of what he's giving us. Then there's the mystery school connection with Cayce, and I mentioned that a number of occasions he speaks of the Great White Brotherhood. And again, white just not relating to anything racially. But the Great White Brotherhood is that brotherhood that is in that etheric plane, which can manifest as a human being. And it is the top mystery school. That is, basically where all of these initiates aspire to and take their instruction from. So everything from the Rosicrucian wave and all this stuff, the Great White Brotherhood is the core kind of leader of the entire thing. They are moving the culture forward spiritually. And there are all these mystery schools in this kind of ladder of secrets and knowledge around it. The presence of the Great White Brotherhood in the Cayce readings is dramatic, and it looks out into the 21st century so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the Atlantean debacle, where we came up against our own kind of greed, and we faced off against the Sons of Belial, and the Sons of Belial, they won in the battle against the Amelius group. Cayce, again, it has to be pointed out, his method was very simple. This wasn't like Aleister Crowley doing all these rituals and things. Cayce would lie down on a couch, get a suggestion, go into trance, and give the information that was requested. And he had a lot of waking psychic ability. There's one classic incident where he stops this total stranger, this woman coming down the stairs of this building, and he says, "Don't go in the car today." And she has this aunt who says, "Oh, we're going for a ride in the country." And the woman somehow was impressed by what Cayce said, and she said no. And in fact, the aunt got in a terrible accident. So he had this kind of waking consciousness that was going on a regular basis, and later in life would also see those who had passed beyond as well. And so he had a number of unusual experiences. If you go back early into Cayce's life, you'll find some unusual things, like there are a series of fires around him. This I found interesting. When he quit the psychic work, when he was being exploited by his own father and Dr. Ketchum, who were using his readings for purposes other than, kind of, they would give the reading, and then afterwards they would ask him about all these horse races and things like that. And he, when he woke up, wouldn't remember any of it, but he was starting to have incredible migraine headaches walking around. And so that's when this figure, and it sounds like a figure from the Great White Brotherhood, shows up, and he's there, and he's in his photo studio, and this figure walks in, and he says, "You're with the wrong people." And then he turns around, goes away, and Cayce's shocked because, here he is at the time, he's in Alabama, and here's this Indian guru, with a turban on, and comes in. And he goes out and he says to people, "Did you see where that guy went?" And nobody has seen him. In fact, the guy does manifest in a way, the initiate manifests in a way that is visible to the public later in Cayce's life. But I think incidents like this let us know there's something unusual about Cayce's life. He's being guided and moved into these various roles. So we get into some very deep territory with Cayce on that. But what is he telling us? He's telling us the Atlanteans had thieves. So how do you explain to people in the 1920s about cyborgs. Automaton is pretty much the word that you would use. And this is what is left on the cutting room floor in the Cayce work. So, what they decided, well, Cayce was just, he was talking about what the Atlanteans had, and they're all thought forms, and there's a whole section about thought forms that we need to understand. But the projection that Cayce talks about now from the point of view of where we are scientifically and what we've seen being used, we can understand when he talks about projection that he's talking about the same things that scientists are doing in attempting to clone people and in attempting to, set up these various kind of human machine interfaces. That's the projection that he's referring to there, but all the language isn't on board yet. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Edgar Cayce Saves the 21st Century. Incredible. Earth changes and the crisis in world affairs prophecy. This is right in the heart of it, and Cayce brings it through in spades. I will say that Cayce's work over time is held up as great as anyone who's ever tackled these subjects. And it's still an area, I've been reading it since I was a kid, and it's still doors open when you get around the Cayce work. And I think often he's portrayed in this way, as a Sunday school guy. And, and it's true because he was very religious, but they miss so much of the incredible drama of Cayce's readings around Atlantis, which have us going, the Atlanteans, not only are they flying ships through the air and in space, but they're flying them through things. What kind of technology is that? And this is how we get into the whole question around apotheum and things like that. It's the incredible psychic control of the technology that the Atlanteans held. This is the real key when you get around what's being opened up through Steiner's work and through Cayce's story of Atlantis. And although we have great information from all sources, I don't think there's anything in terms of a body of information about Atlantis that even comes close to what Cayce has on it, because Steiner certainly opens our eyes dramatically, but Cayce is sort of living and breathing in the time and talking to these people about who they were then when they had reincarnated back from Atlantis into this current culture. And he talks a little bit about how that happens. I'm going to read a little bit of this. And it's interesting. When Cayce would give the reading for someone, they would ask, well, tell me basically through this life reading about the important subjects that affect my life now. In Cayce, in trance, he would always go backwards. So he's reading the person's life. And in this case, the reading is from 1941. And he's reading 41, 40, 39, 37 preparations. He goes all the way back to the birth date. Yes, we have the records here of that entity now called, they give them each a number to maintain their anonymity, 3029 in this case. Giving the interpretations of the records we find here, these we choose from same with the desire and purpose that this may be a helpful influence for this entity, enabling the entity to better fulfill those purposes for which it entered this present experience. If the entity is to make a career of self, it is entirely engaged in the wrong environment currently, in the wrong activity, for this entity is an Atlantean. As so often indicated, in the periods of certain individuals or groups of souls enter, as between 1909, 1912, 1910, 1911, this brought a great influx of Atlanteans that have had and are having such an influence in the affairs of the world today. Not a hero in the present war, World War II, that was not an Atlantean as yet, living or dead. These are all Atlanteans. Winston Churchill, Hitler, all of them, extremists vying for world power. In giving the interpretations, then, we choose with the hope and the desire that there may be due consideration given in the tendencies of this entity in the present are to allow self to be imposed upon. As each Atlantean, it will either make a wonderful success or it will become almost a complete failure. Extremists. Remember, the Atlanteans are extremists. That's the culture that we're in right now. And right now, I'm afraid they're headed for a complete failure. A little more here, different reading, same type of impression. But here's what the questioner says. What's the true significance of a visit in my childhood from a member of the White Brotherhood and later of revelations and mystical experiences I had. Cayce answers, is it any wonder from the experiences through which the entity as Joel passed? And Joel is a figure in the Bible that witnesses the birth of Jesus. Before that, we find the entity was in the Atlantean land during those periods, particularly when there was the exodus from Atlantis, owing to the foretelling or foreordination of those activities which were bringing about destructive forces. There we find the entity was among those who were not only in what is now known as the Yucatan land, but also the Pyrenees and the Egyptian. For the manners of transportation, the manners of communications through the airships of that period were such as Ezekiel described at a much later date. This is very important. I've made this kind of spotlighted this before. Here's what's crucial about what Cayce just said. First of all, Cayce read the Bible every day, and he talked a lot about the Ezekiel experience. But here he is tapping in to the Atlantean experience of that period, and he's tapping in to Ezekiel, and he's saying, if you want a description of those airships of that period, basically it's like what Ezekiel described, but that's a much later date. So here we have Ezekiel, before Christ, but Atlantean technology supposedly died out 10,500 BC. They buried the Hall of Records and everything else. Who's holding on to this technology through 9,000 years? And whoever beheld that technology thought they were dealing with God. Well, in fact, if they were dealing with the Atlanteans, who are the Emilius group, then they are dealing with a very spiritual technology going on there. Some of those accounts of Ezekiel, and the Ezekiel story is very strange in the Bible, but I'm going to read what Ezekiel's account is, and let's see if we can crisscross that with what Cayce told us. So there's a wheel within a wheel. On the wheel are eyes. And at a certain point, they give him a scroll to eat. And there are other images, of course, where he says, well, it seemed like the likeness of these different animals. You have a bull over here, a lion here, a man here, a bird here. And then this individual that he's looking up to there is probably whoever is driving that ship. No, ancient aliens, it's not an alien, it's an Atlantean with the advanced Atlantean technology. And Ezekiel is tapping into the spiritual side of it, but not realizing that's an Atlantean ship. Now, here's the quote from Ezekiel going into this. And he says, then I looked and I saw 4 wheels beside the cherubim, 1 wheel beside each cherub, and the wheels gleamed like a beryl stone. For their appearance, all 4 had the same form, like a wheel within a wheel. Remember, Ezekiel, he's no peasant. This is somebody who has his own mechanical skill. And although it's often portrayed that, he's kind of wandering in the desert, and he's somebody who's well schooled. So he's seeing this wheel within a wheel. He's giving us the best description he can of this technology he's beholding, which must seem absolutely fantastic. For their appearance, when they moved, they would go in any of the 4 directions without turning as they moved. For whichever the head faced, the cherubim would go in that direction without turning as they moved. Their entire bodies, including their backs, hands, and wings, were full of eyes all around, as were the 4 wheels. I heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels. Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. The first face was that of a cherub, the second that of a man, the third was that of a lion, the fourth that of an eagle. Then the cherubim rose upwards. These were the living creatures I'd seen by the river Kebar. When the cherubim moved, the wheels moved beside them, and even when they spread their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels did not veer far away from their side. When the cherubim stood still, the wheels also stood still. And when they ascended, the wheels ascended with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. You get a glimpse there of the advanced technology that the Atlanteans had. And it's interesting because what it reminded me of when I was looking at it and reading it, I was thinking, it reminds me of the Betty and Barney Hill story, oddly enough, because they were looking at a huge craft. This thing had landed. They were in an unusual situation. I'm not suggesting that the beings that they encountered were spiritual by any stretch of the imagination, but there's some similarity in these accounts. And instead of going to the space piece on it, it's very interesting that Cayce gives us this little insight that, in fact, the Ezekiel description of these ships are the same things that the Atlanteans had. That maybe opens up a whole different field of endeavor about what we're talking about when you're dealing with the UFO file. There's a whole piece attached there, and it's right there hanging out in the Ezekiel material. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist extra special report for you here tonight. Edgar Cayce saves the 21st century. Well, maybe there's information in this Earth changes, land rising aspects that does save the 21st century. Is it possible? The Crisis in World Affairs Prophecy. We're going to be taking your questions here. Actually, what I'll do, I have more to go over, but I'm going to jump into your questions with Miss Olivia now, and I'll just keep peppering the conversation as we go. And we'll go for, say, another half hour or so. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Okay, Simone Nyman. Does DJ think Cayce was communicating with Enoch, the Watchers, and walked with God?
Well, it's interesting because there are strange things in Enoch's story and the presence of Melchizedek in the Bible. But then there are the books of Enoch that were left out of the Bible. And, a lot of these guys hunting around for the ancient aliens part, once they got their hands on the Enoch book, were like, whoa. Because it really does sound like a group of advanced extraterrestrials leading Enoch around. Those are the things they took out of the Bible. But you can also look at it, and there are hints in Steiner's work about the advanced Nephilim coming in, and they're so advanced to us. They're not coming in from, Alpha Centauri. They're coming in from an advanced level here, but they're operating on a high spiritual level. And if the Nephilim come in and fall from that position, then what do you have? You have a very advanced being that is neither human nor any longer high spiritual Nephilim. You have something else. So I think that Cayce certainly includes Enoch in his work. And I think in terms of that connection that he has to the Old Testament, there's something deep working through him, like the prophets of old. And he falls, for me, I think there's a reason why we call him the sleeping prophet. He falls in kind of a modern, he's like kind of a modern version of one of those early prophets like Ezekiel, like Enoch. And so there is a connection there for sure. Yes.
Okay, let's focus on Rata for a second.
Yeah.
So George Ivankovich says, is Cayce saying he was an offspring of the fallen ones? And Jimmy Lau Kennemer says, could Rata be Melchizedek?
There's never anything about Rata and fallen ones. It seems like he's the opposite. He's kind of saintly, but his demeanor is so unusual for the people that are around him, who are a working group of industrial people from the mountains who are coming down, through Iran into Egypt. And here we have this psychically gifted individual who goes into trance, and they know, and they treat him strangely and his family strangely because he's a daughter of Zu, and they know, oh, he doesn't have a human father. Cayce doesn't suggest who his father is, but you get some idea there that he's half human and half something else. It's very clear, not begotten of man. So he's a kind of a spiritual conception. I got an interesting insight. I took this question. I talk about a group called the Transcenders, the late Rick Thurston, who gave me so much interesting information around the UFO file before I was doing dark journalism. I mean, I sort of did it on my own. And one of the things that he said that I found interesting when I took this question to him was that Rata was a part of this Atlantean line where they could transfer the consciousness from one individual into another individual. And then that individual would carry the consciousness for a certain period of time. And then they would take that consciousness and place it in another individual, and so on down the line. That's not reincarnation. Certainly, Rata becomes reincarnated as Cayce, and Cayce holds in the work that reincarnation is a fact when you look at these things. For the mystery schools, reincarnation is a fact. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is Steiner and Cayce agree that John the Baptist was reincarnated as Raphael to bring the great Renaissance connection forward. This is very interesting because often you'll find a crisscross in mystery school literature, and you'll wonder which one is correct. So Rudolf Steiner, when he was looking out at Woodrow Wilson, said, Wilson had good intentions, but he was easily overpowered by others, and you can see that he wasn't, very well developed spiritually. But Cayce said that Wilson, in this Council of the League of Nations, and when Wilson was saying we shouldn't have the Treaty of Versailles and all the rest of it, that the Christ himself was speaking through Wilson. So we have to kind of, different levels from the mystery initiates looking at the same situation sometimes can come to different conclusions. It becomes an unusual conundrum for us. But when you're a high initiate, you still have your own opinion, as it turns out. And so you're going to have your opinion one way or the other. But what's interesting is when that information crisscrosses, as it does in the case of Cayce and Steiner, both referring to Raphael as this reincarnation of John the Baptist. So there's another interesting point where Cayce, when he's first struggling with the idea of reincarnation, because he comes from such a Christian background, he opens up to the story when Elijah and John the Baptist are featured in the New Testament. And so there's a point where they ask Jesus, was Elijah coming back? And Jesus said, Elijah came back already, and those authorities chopped his head off. And then the disciples were like, oh, he's talking about John the Baptist. So they understood reincarnation. And so reincarnation was taken out of the Bible at a certain point. So there was an early Christian mystery tradition that had it in there. And so it was lost, and they moved it out. There are different methods in mystery schools. I remember the Gurdjieff work it didn't deny reincarnation, but it didn't stress it. Whereas the Cayce work, Theosophy, Anthroposophy, they felt it was important to include because you wouldn't have the real true understanding of soul development otherwise. There's also something, though, since we're talking about incarnations, which is the mystery schools that are public that we know about talk about this progression through the planets, that you go through these different incarnations. Some of them you go from here on Earth, and then you go to an incarnation on Venus in a Venus body, not in something that we can see physically here. But you take those lessons through each of these classrooms back to your lifetime in this system. And then Cayce talks about the doorway in the system. Once you've developed enough to have sort of mastered this system, the doorway out is Arcturus. This is all very interesting because I feel like those aspects are being put on the record, just like when Blavatsky came out with her information. This is this is the period of awakening around these spiritual traditions. And the question becomes, how well have we as a culture assimilated the mystery teachings and the kind of spiritual incursions? It becomes maybe something to be looked at and said, maybe a lot of things have already been laid out for us, and people are grasping around after different things, like, oh, disclosure is going to save me. But in truth, the Atlantean information and our acknowledging this past in Atlantis is way more important than any kind of disclosure movement about aliens, which would just be like, oh, there are peers of ours somewhere else. I mean, that's significant for sure, but not as significant as our own true past in Atlantis, in my opinion. And then sometimes I get sick of them when they say, the biggest story of humankind would be if we found aliens. It's not actually true. The biggest story of humankind is resurrection, right? That has to be the biggest story. Just knowing that there are aliens out there doesn't change that. What about life after death? I mean, so it's, these things, there's a lot of hype around different subjects. And I think it's better if we just take it as a broad swath of awareness around things. And, people running over a cliff for the alien thing. Look, the UFO file is important, and the acknowledgement around what's going on there is crucial. But the game that they're playing with it and the misdeal, the misdirection going on with it is becomes almost like an evil temptation on behalf of the intelligence agencies to control humanity. So that's we're in a kind of a sick state where they're electing to give you the wrong disclosure. In fact, their disclosure has nothing to do with UFO disclosure. Yes.
Peter Rabbit, was there any weather modification in Atlantis? And Bobo the Clown, please ask DJ to give his opinion on how we can discern real natural Earth changes from the fomented crisis given us by the climate activists / terrorists.
Yeah, look, here's what they can be using. This is how we can understand things on a much better level. This is why I think the Cayce information, the Steiner information is left there for a reason. It is the Earth changes aspect was crucial. Now, what happened was there were people who came out and misused it, and again used it for big headlines to sell books or whatever. There was one guy, what was he? Gordon Scallion. Gordon. I always say it sounds like all I have to do is think of omelets. It's like, okay, Gordon Michael Scallion and a little horseradish. All right. So this guy came out and he used all of the Cayce readings and pretended he was getting the visions. And then but he came to all these terrible things like, oh, there's an atomic war and all this stuff. So there's tons of that. There's tons of imitating of these figures. And that happened in Blavatsky's period. It happened with Cayce. And with Cayce's stuff, it riveted through, especially in the 90s. There's a readoption of this. And some of that, some of that's good too. But by and large, what you have is marketeering going on. And Gaia TV becomes the ultimate in that. They throw everything in there. We've had our own thing where, I've worked enough around CEOs and companies and PR firms and stuff like that I know what they're looking at. And so I went into Gaia TV's white paper that they were sending out to their own investors. And one of the things, they included the Dark Journalist show in one of their white papers. And it said something like, one of the reasons we can't get more subscribers is there are people like this out there. And, basically they're making so much information available to the public that we can't get a foothold. So they're basically, not only do they watch these shows and, vacuum up ideas and things that we put out, like at Gigi Young's work. Gaia TV is like, what do they take 3/4 of their content from Gigi Young's work? Think about it really. And the amount of X themes and things that they've borrowed and all kinds of nonsense that they've made up. And, it wouldn't matter. It's great because there always has to be some sort of superficial level thing that people are going to understand. But I don't, the potency question, I've pointed this out, this year is all about understanding what's potent and what is just sort of superficial fluff. And this occasion of the Grush thing and the UFO push and all the rest of it is a perfect example. It gives us the perfect opportunity, but it also suggests maybe that in the land of the UFO piece, the UFO file, that we're in a kind of a dangerous thing because the government now and the intelligence agencies are trying to use that to scare the public into giving up more money and more control. And so that's a dangerous, they've been working on it, but what we should be working on is who is controlling the UFO file? What are they doing with it? And how does it affect the question around technology? How does that affect the geopolitics that we're seeing on the ground? Hello, Russia. So this is the nature, I think, of where we're going. Yes.
Denise Hopkins, DJ, when Cayce was under hypnosis, his voice and cadence changed. In your opinion, was he projecting his oversoul or was his soul overtaken by a walk-in?
No, I think it's interesting because other psychics who used guides, like Eileen McGarrett, came to him and their guide would say, I can guide you. This will be a much easier process from you. You won't suffer all these physical things that happen to you. And over again, he denied that because he had such a Christian understanding. He had his own experiences, deep spiritual experiences to draw on. And, one of the more fascinating stories back there is when he's going through a past life that he had as Yolt in Persia. He's a leader who sets up this kind of almost large scale, it sounds like a new age community out there where they're doing all these things like holistic treatments. And it's really like a spiritual culture, and everyone comes there from all around the world. Well, Yolt, at a certain point, faces off, and he's going to rescue this woman. And as he goes to rescue her, he gets shot by an arrow in the desert, and he is dying, in fact. And what he does, it's such a painful situation that he's in, that he wills himself out of his body. And when he leaves his body, this memory of being able to do this, when he becomes Cayce, he's able to do it again. He has a natural ability from this memory of dying in the desert and willing himself out of his body, that he can do it at will when he reincarnates as Cayce. So this is an interesting thing about how we understand the traits that we develop over various lives. This is what Cayce is, I think, giving us. But no, I think he certainly could act as a medium when he wanted to. So if there was information standing by, there are times when voices like the Archangel Michael come through him. And you see a lot of people doing that Archangel Michael stuff. If you go back to the Cayce readings, there's a real connection there. If you go into the Steiner readings, there's all this stuff about Michael, and you see it exploited a lot, unfortunately, with imposters and things. But the true understanding around this kind of spiritual war goes very deeply into the Archangel Michael side. So yeah, very fascinating indeed. And no, I don't think there were walk-ins with Cayce. I think he was dealing, when he left his body, he was dealing with the source. And the way he described it is he saw himself as a light going out of his body, and he would go through kind of the dark side of the astral plane first, and he would see misshapen forms. Then things would get a little bit brighter. He would see cities and towns and hear noises. And then he would go a little bit further, and then things became very, very fast and, almost kind of cosmic, like the the end of 2001 Space Odyssey. And then he shows up at this place where he's aware of an initiate handing him the record of the person that has asked to give the reading, and he reads it, and then that's his experience during the reading. What I found interesting, and may give us an idea of how the superconscious subconscious works, is that Cayce talks about having dreams while he's giving readings. So he'll be giving a reading over here, but his unconscious mind is dreaming. What kind of mechanism is going on for that? That's absolutely fascinating. Yes.
Nena says again, does Cayce speak of Hawaii at all? And Dan Mariani, did Cayce have any readings that touched on wildfires like those strange ones in Maui or Paradise that seem to be targeted?
It's interesting. I had some quotes about weather manipulation. And this goes more into a kind of a different episode, and it's something I'll probably enlist Ilana Freeland for us to get a real address on this. And she's done some great shows with us in the past. I'm still reading her fantastic, wonderful book on geoengineering. And I've read her 2 previous books, had a big influence on me. And she does great, incredible research, Ilana, on the space fence and HARP, everything else. She really had quite a trajectory on this, and her work was so far advanced that when all this stuff started to hit over, say, the past 5 years, I went back to that quite a bit. But here's the quote from the Secretary of Defense under Clinton in 1997. This is his actual quote. William Cohen, who was a Republican, by the way. Quote, Senate hearing. Others are engaging even in an eco type of terrorism whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. So there are plenty of ingenious minds out there that are at work finding ways in which they can wreak terror upon other nation. It's real, and that's the reason why we have to intensify our efforts. Now here he is talking about being able to block weather modification, you know, weaponizing earthquake technology, things of this nature, disaster capitalism, in fact. But here he's testifying to it as a Secretary of Defense. Basically, this is an admission that, well, if they have it, certainly we have it. So that can't be missed. And I think what's interesting too is there's been a lot, and I mean a lot of attempts. I knew about this maybe 15 years ago. And it started to, I reported on it, in 2015 or something in terms of some of the shows. But there was a whole effort in the past decade, you still see it, to say, he never said that. Look, it's on record. It's a Senate commission. There's no doubting it. And he said it. So it's already been admitted. Even if he hadn't admitted it, we would have known anyway. If you go back to LBJ, he gives, while Kennedy's still president, he gives a speech in Texas, and he talks about whoever controls the weather controls the world. And he talks about the ability to create weather weapons. So they had it back then. Look, Nikola Tesla reported that not only did he have an earthquake device in 1901, but that it fit in his pocket. That's how advanced the X technology is. That's what we're talking about. And when the person he was talking to didn't believe him, he gave them a demonstration. And then they came to his lab and said, you have to stop whatever it is you're doing. There's an earthquake going on here. That's in Manhattan. That's on record. So this stuff now, 125 years later, how much more advanced are we on that? So, certainly they've taken Tesla's information and exploited it. No question. That's where the X goes. So when you want to talk about X technology, if you want to talk about why our friend here is sitting here as the spokesman of X, and why X is X, and why the X steganography is taken off, look, they have the advanced technology. They want to strut with the advanced technology. And they, that's on their building now. We put this on the record, of course, 2017, starting with the X series, giving you this information. There's a reason why the X piece is there. There's an occult reason. There's an advanced technology reason. But the symbol, the steganography, is clear. And, you don't have to be somebody who sees signs and symbols and everything. It's just that the idea of steganography is, look, it's something that's out there in the public. It's not hidden. That's the whole point. It has to be something that's rather commonplace. And those who are initiates in its operation know it and can spot it. So, I've used that explanation before, but I sometimes wonder, with all the X stuff that's going on, I probably have to do a whole overview that matches up with these 200 episodes of the X series on the X steganography again. Yes.
Gillenjoy R. Did Cayce predict any big events in the Middle East or Israel end of the world much?
Well, he talked a lot about free will. There are some actual predictions I'm going to read that relate to the pole shift. So that's how I'm going to answer your question. By the way, that's Musk's tweet. X as humanity's collective consciousness. Are you serious?
When was that from?
There's your X steganography. That's a couple of days ago. August 18th, actually. I guess a week ago. But, days turn into weeks around here. Here is going back to the readings here temporarily for a moment. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, so we'll go about another 15 minutes. How does that, Robbie? Fantastic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Fantastic to share this report with you. And, of course, we started the night off talking about the Trump indictment and all the crazy things that he had to endure when he went to Atlanta. This is a crazy situation that we're in, where one party in government is prosecuting their opponent through these frivolous, now 4 different indictments. And then who's really running the country? We're getting into very dangerous territory going into 2024. One of the things I've put on the record is that the UFO file is going to be in the heart of the 2024 campaign. So whoever is out there in it to win it, Trump and Bobby Kennedy, they have got to include that UFO side on this. And the other thing I think that we could be seeing is there's more of a fracturing of Biden support, which was weak to start with, because of all the flubs in public and because people are getting sick of seeing all this money being sent over to Ukraine to enrich these military contractors. And there's no stopping because Biden isn't operating with a normal conscience because he's not all there. And so therefore the committee behind him can, they'll do anything that they want to achieve their aims. And that's the whole Victoria Nuland neocon crowd. So they really are risking nuclear war. And the fact that the media has gone to sleep on this whole thing is extremely dangerous. So this is the nature of the world that we're in. We need a president who will pull us out of that. RFK Jr. or Trump can do the job. And so it's going to be one of the two.
Can I just chime in for a second?
Oh, yeah.
They haven't gone to sleep on it. I mean, they're part of Bilderberg.
Right.
They're in on the whole thing.
Say they've gone quiet on it. All right. So we'll go a little bit further. Oh, I want to remind everyone, especially if you're new, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our free newsletter. It keeps us in touch. We're suffering under the weight of really heavy duty censorship, but the best way to get around that is literally the newsletter, and you'll get that once a week. No heavy marketing or anything like that in there, but you will learn about some very interesting and important events coming up, fantastic X-Series shows that are coming, and incredible interviews that are coming up, including with Gigi Young is coming up. And of course, Dr. Farrell, his new book is arriving in a couple of days. I'll be spending a lot of time on that. We'll have him back on about that new book and some surprise interviews for you as well. All there in the newsletter, darkjournalist.com, and it takes 30 seconds to sign up. Go to darkjournalist.com and make sure you stand up and be counted. Okay, so we'll go a little further here with the Cayce readings since it came up in the question. Let's see if I can answer that last question about predictions and bring this around. I want to point out the apotheum term that I use, APOTHEUM. This is the quality that is in the UFO file. That's also in the heart of the X technology. There's an aspect here that goes back to ancient times, that goes back, in fact, to that Atlantean science. And apotheum is the term that I came up with. There's enough terms in history that show up that are like it here and there, but I decided to use that as the central term for this reality distortion field. And again, when people bastardize some of the stuff that we put out on the X series, as we've seen it, it gets weird. It gets pretty weird because they'll use the phrase without understanding its connection to apotheum. And that happened in that whole Pippa interview that I mentioned earlier. But it is important to get the full picture. So sometimes those little things on top, if you don't go a half inch deeper, then you're getting a very superficial layer. And I've mentioned that in relation to the UFO file. We get tons of that, as if just the mere fact that, News Nation uses the term UFO or some lame term like UAP. It's ridiculous. What does that got to do with anything? Everyone understands what a UFO is. But this is important because if they were only doing the superficial glint of it just to get a hit in the ratings or whatever, which is what they got, that doesn't mean anything. What you're going to need to do in this period that we're in the setup to the election year is go for very potent information, what's really going on, and not fall for the fluff stuff on top, which we had tons of with Gaia TV and other things. Look, that stuff's always going to be there. I'm not saying it's going to go away. I'm just saying in terms of, a research field, that stuff is kind of a joke, so we need to kind of keep that in mind. We want to go for the real stuff. And, I push myself to try to get the substance piece out to you because I want you to have that. And that's what we're dedicated to in dark journalism, is getting this level of it out. When you're dealing with historical events like the Kennedy assassination, you don't want to hear any stupid things like, well, did Oswald do it, or was it somebody? We've already, it's been proven that Oswald was set up as the Bobo to take the fall for the whole thing. We already know that. And so there isn't, there's a depth level in this type of presentation, which is, it doesn't lend itself to, a 1 minute short, or, somebody said, do a 30-minute version of your program. There's no way to do it. And I'm happy to do shorter clips of these longer broadcasts, but when you're going in depth on something, you're going to spend time on it. And those who can hang with it are going to hang with it, and the others are going to get a short shrift version like News Nation or something. So I would say it's very important, not only for the presenters to step up and give better information, but for the audience not to go for the fast food junk. It's a cooperative thing. And what's interesting is the real deal is so much more fascinating, that the people who go over a cliff for like the phony Grush CIA stuff or whatever are really doing themselves a disservice. And for newer people coming into the field who don't know anything about it, right, the newbies, as it were, if that's their first exposure, it's kind of tragic, because there's so much good information that's deep in the UFO file, and that could be anything from Jim Garrison's work to Stanton Friedman. Jim Mars. There are layers of information, and that's the way I think we need to look at it. Okay, back to the readings here real quickly, and then a couple of roundup questions. All right, and then we'll call it a night, everyone. Great to have so many of you here with us. What a fantastic crowd in the ideas room. I want more of your questions. Let's see.
This is the biggest crowd we've had in a while. That's
wonderful. Well, it's fantastic, and I love spending time on the Cayce work. It's been kind of a fascination of mine my whole life, pretty much. All right. Here's a reading. Before this, we find this entity was in the land known as the Poseidian land. Poseidon is very important because that's what's rising there off the East Coast. During those periods when the people had come from Muir, M-U-I-R, this is interesting too, the Cayce terms. He's giving us those names, the elusive names, and Lemuria, and the other lands, for the indwelling of the various activities, the seeking together for the divining of many activities or principles in human endeavor. The entity was then among those who would be termed in the present an alchemist in the period, and was in the name A-R-L-U, as would be termed in the present from the combinations of those sounds. In the experience of this entity, they gained and they lost and they gained, for much was turned into the abilities of subserving people to the whims and fancies of the entity. This person became a ruler through their kind of Crowley-like ability in Atlantis, when there was the establishment of manners, ways, and means for communication. Hence, this entity was what today would be called an architect, drawing plans, laying out means for transportation and boats. So this is somebody with a great mechanical background. So they come back and they have this ability this time, and he's saying, you have to get into this, like aerospace, this is your thing. And here's an interesting little tidbit. He said, you had another life in the Atlantean land, and your name was Tul-Mep-On. Before those periods, during those periods of great expansion as to ways, means, and manners of applying greater conveniences for the peoples of the land, things of transportation, the airplane, as called today, but also ships in the air, as they sailed not only in the air, but in other elements also. So that's a hint there. And then he talks about the ships that they have that go through mountains and come out the other side. So there's a dematerialization aspect along with the anti-gravity. This goes deep. Let me see here. Okay, Miss Olivia, you can go ahead. Oh, here's the, this is actually the prediction I wanted to read. So this is a good time to do it. It is very heavy duty. And all right. So he's being asked, what is the nature of the world affairs that we're in? This is in the 1930s. I think it's 1935, in fact. So it says, as to the material changes that are to be as an omen, as a sign that this is shortly to come to pass, as has been given of old, the sun will be darkened, and the earth shall be proclaimed and broken up in diverse places, and then shall be proclaimed through the spiritual interception in the hearts and minds and souls of those that have sought that his star has approached and appeared. This is very spiritual language coming in here. As to the changes physical, again, the earth will be broken up in the western portion of America. The greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. Now, it's interesting. They had that great disaster. We've seen some really big earthquakes in Japan, but we've had that incredible disaster, Fukushima. And the water now, they've decided after holding on to it for 10 years, is being pumped into the ocean. So China just banned Japanese seafood. That's huge. And that's what's happening here. And in terms of some of the destabilization of Japan, I find Cayce's readings around this strangely compelling. But he says the greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. The upper portion of Europe will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. That's pretty quick. Land will appear off the east coast of America. That's in the Steiner work. That's throughout the Cayce work. Land rising. Annie Besant. Land rising. Where's this coming from? Why don't we hear anything about land rising? It's there. It is happening. That's why the Poseidon Temple will be found again. And one of the main places, it's Poseidia that's rising up there off Bimini. So we have some ideas here of what's going on, but we're not being told about it. We're being told about climate change, and we're in the middle of all this weather diversion and the number of weather warfare things that are going on for disaster capitalism. And no doubt some of the emergencies, of course, earthquakes, weather problems, all these things have happened throughout humanity. But the ability for humanity now and the controllers and the leadership to use those things is at a level we've never seen before. So we have to be aware of both, as that person who asked the question earlier, how can we tell what's a legitimate event versus something that's being utilized? Well, the amount of disaster capitalism is probably some kind of an indication there for sure. But I'm always very hesitant to jump to any conclusions, except there are so many weird things in relation to the recent situation that I don't think you could take it as completely at face value by a long shot. But let's go a little bit deeper with this. So, twinkling of an eye in Europe, upper portion, land off the east coast of America, upheavals in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. Is that why they're going down there, getting ready? That will make for the eruptions of volcanoes in the torrid areas. There will be the shifting then of the poles, so that where there has been those of frigid or semi-tropical will become the more tropical, and moss and fern will grow. All right. As to times, as to seasons, as to places, alone it is given to those who have named the name and who bear the mark. To them it shall be given. And he goes into something there about the call, his calling and going into the Christ teaching, and how, this is part of this whole piece. It's kind of like Revelation playing out. What's interesting is he talks about a testing period between 58 and 98 that sets this up. And then from 98 on, we're in the soup. So we've been in the soup here for 25 years. And this gets back to what I was saying in the very beginning of the show, which is that there's some strange characteristic that people who say grew up in the 50s and 60s, when I talk to them, they talk about things differently. And then when you talk to people who grew up in the 70s and 80s, they're still in a much more grounded reality about things. But if you get into later periods, in the period that we're in, a number of things seem unusual to people. The state of the world seems unusual. This is what Cayce was driving at. And so finally, some of the terms here, when we get into Armageddon, this isn't a doom prophecy at all. Cayce's warning about a condition. And remember, Armageddon is war in the air. And Cayce suggests something quite fascinating. He says that the battle between Armageddon, what it means is the souls leaving the earth and those that are tempting as emissaries to enter and being blocked. There's a battle there. Those attempting to come in and help the situation with Earth as emissaries are being blocked. So there's a gigantic mystery and a mystery school battle in the heart of that as well. One more piece around
Can
this.
I interrupt you right there?
Yeah.
Because I wanted to ask you before about the Sons of Belial and what kind of dark magic they practice. And
Yeah.
what kind of magic could block souls that want to enter, that are of the light?
Yeah, that is really fascinating. I mean, this gets into what answers that, interestingly enough, is the harmonic eighth sphere activity. So in the Steiner setup, what you have is something that happens where souls, instead of going into their normal development through this system, get interrupted by something called the eighth sphere. And the eighth sphere is very unusual too, because Steiner said something along the lines of, this was one of the biggest secrets that the mystery schools didn't want to let out. And it got let out through an unusual situation through a theosophist. And he got some of the information about the eighth sphere correct, but then he attributed it and thought it was the moon. And this, from the kind of occult cosmology, esoteric cosmology, was totally wrong. And it forced Steiner to come out with a correction. So there's a lot of weird things, including the fact that Blavatsky also attempted to put the genie back in the bottle on that one. But the eighth sphere being this kind of virtual reality realm that we're being projected into. So in the 21st century, we have it on the technological side, people spending all this time in relation to video games, that whole meta platform, meta world, where you have an avatar and you walk around and your physical body kind of, just goes away while you're in a VR unit. That whole piece is kind of a capturing of consciousness. So in Steiner's work, he's saying that Ahriman is set up as this entity that would come through the technology. And again, this is not to demonize technology. It's just, he's saying this is the challenge for humanity. And in fact, Steiner doesn't say become a Luddite. He says you need to engage. Humanity needs to engage this great challenge. And that's the whole harmonic battle. So the things that are being employed when you get to a point of, the afterlife and incarnation and things of this nature, there are strange stories that, and Steiner refers to some of these, where he says, look, Blavatsky, they already knew that she had come in here astrologically. So they didn't have to track the person at all. They knew astrologically that someone of this nature, who was going to have these incredible mediumistic abilities and kind of the old pagan abilities to rise into the spiritual world, stay conscious, and bring the information back. So they were aware of her before she showed up on the scene. So they're already aware of the nature of things. You remember the very famous thing that Cayce said when they asked him about the pyramid. They said, are there pyramids? Do they have prophecies? Are they contained inside the Great Pyramid? And he said, absolutely. And they said, well, how accurate are they? And he said, well, they're so accurate that, it'll name the person's date of birth, the street they grow up on, the family name that they're under, and the things that they'll do. So you think about the things that are laid out there in advance, and how could the Great Pyramid have anything to do with that? It's almost like it's some kind of suggestion of a supercomputer that knows all about the different activities that happen on a day-to-day basis, and that there's a series of codes, numbers, dates, events that relate to all of it. That's the fascinating thing there. Okay, last question.
Let me just throw these two out,
Yes.
these ideas. Gail
Okay.
Seib says, Alana Freeland talks about the egregore, which is something like an intention that passes through generations. So I was thinking, you can manifest an egregore, or even, I don't know, something like, I was thinking like a prism. You could create sort of a technology where it warps the souls entering. So like creates an inversion. Anyway, there's that.
Oh
And
yeah.
Salt of the Earth says it could also be CERN being activated and opening wormholes to dark lower frequencies.
I think that see, the thing is, I want to attribute to CERN things that it could be doing, but I also want to be careful enough not to just say, well, CERN's responsible for this. We know very unusual things about CERN. One, it's set up as this kind of gigantic intermediary between here and other dimensions. So they didn't describe that at all when they started it. They said they were looking for the God particle by smashing particles together. And that's why we have the Large Hadron Collider. It's not CERN at all. That's the nuclear agency that everything is under the umbrella of. It's really the LHC. And now they have the biggest and baddest LHC, Large Hadron Collider. Now here's the interesting thing. The setup for particle colliders and things like that go back to the Varian brothers, which is something we explored very early in the X series. But the Varian brothers came out of the most hardcore group of Theosophists that split off and went to the West Coast. And they had an ascended master there who was in charge in the Theosophical lexicon of the purple ray of science. And they went on, the Varian brothers, to be a major foundation of the founding of Silicon Valley. But they were offering even portable versions of particle colliders as early as the 1930s. So if you put that type of information together with the Macy conferences that happened in the 1940s that were about cybernetics and developing cyborgs and all these different things, then you see that this is a much older piece that we're getting laid out now. When they talk about and they sit down and they have these conversations about artificial intelligence and do all this hand-wringing, like, what are we going to do about AI and everything else? Look, they've known about it behind the scenes for how long? They had AI, demonstrable AI in the 1960s. So by the 80s, they really had a decent version that they could weigh out. They already know what it can do. They already know its level of malevolent misuse that's possible. And so in a sense, some of the warnings are hollow and meant to set up this thing. Just, and I like using the UFO file a lot because I feel like there's a lot of education on that side that we still need. The way that they use the UFO file now is the same thing. They set up a group, a phony group, and you have researchers in the field calling people like Elizondo and Mellon insurgents. They're not. They're not insurgents. They're from the CIA, and they want to help you. So what they've done is they created their own divisions to be like, here's the good guy, here's the bad guy. And now instead of having real citizens go after the government trying to press UFO information out of them, they have a phony CIA group who's like, we've got to fight that government. And if you look at them, they work for the government. This is the same thing that we're in the middle of. So we have to be very aware, I think, when we get into these situations of what it is exactly that's being put out around these things, and what constitutes legitimate critics and opposition to something versus what they figure the public wants to hear to get off their backs. And they're all in intel people sharing all the same secrecy around the UFO file, but getting ready to profit extensively off it. It's interesting. I want to take a moment and read something that came out. I mentioned that in relation to Chris Mellon, who's a former DoD official leading the CIA UFO threat stuff. And it's interesting. Of course, we had John Warner, his cousin, on this program multiple times, and he's a great guest. We'll get him back for the fall as well. And he's done some courageous things, pointing out what his cousin did, as part of this. And, not demonizing anybody, but, he pointed out, look, they know what they're doing, and this is the nature of it. That's important, though. We need to kind of respect that type of effort, because we need more of that. Because very often you'll just hear people say, well, this is just these millionaires fighting among each other or whatever. It's really not. I think it takes a lot of courage for a guy like John to face up against his brother who's coming out of the DoD and running this UFO threat stuff, to say, hey, enough is enough. And I'm calling it out, whether that costs me, my seat at Mellon events or not. And this is very significant. The types of things that happen are far more important, the types of information and people calling things out. That's how you get around things like the Grush op and stuff like that, because people like Grush can be used as a bobo. And, he's done enough dancing. He's done enough of the, if he was a real whistleblower, this would be a very different situation. But there's this whole intel, co-intel dancing thing. Well, we'll talk in the skiff and all that stuff. That has nothing to do with disclosure. These are operations. And then when you go behind even a half inch deep, you find that the person who's his lawyer is the architect of the Patriot Act. That's one. And then two, that Lou Elizondo and those types of people were grooming him. But anyway, this came out, and it came out through the Black Vault. And it says, new documents unveil Elizondo and Mellon's push for the Pentagon to clarify Elizondo's role in ATIP. Remember, ATIP didn't exist. It was just an activity. And he wanted to come out. They needed the program about a whistleblower who came out of a UFO program and was angry at the government, So he was saying, you have to back me up. And they were using threat letters. And one of the things, all the letters are coming from Mellon. And remember, Mellon not only has the big financial pull, but he's deep in that defense environment, Intel Defense Department. Now, Mellon says, in speaking to this division that's not giving Elizondo any of his props, frankly, quote, frankly, it might well be to lose benefit, and that of TTSA and the History Channel, to have a pissing match about this with DoD OSD, but personally, I'd hate to see that. I'm glad that does not seem to have occurred to Lou yet, but it may become unavoidable if some clarification, since his integrity is being publicly called into question. What's going on there is that's blackmail on the part of Mellon, trying to get these people to say he was a leader of a UFO program when he clearly wasn't, because there's no trail of him involved with that. And he himself, in his own document that he signed to the Inspector General, said, well, it wasn't a program that was funded. It was just an activity. Yeah, well, walking your dog's an activity too. So Elizondo was an early piece of this. They're going to try to revive him in the middle of all this. But I think that this is pretty interesting that they mentioned TTSA and the History Channel, because who set that up? After all, the CIA set up TTSA. They definitely set up the History Channel show. As a matter of fact, the ratings on that show were so low that it seemed like the other way around. Instead of them getting paid to make the show, they made the show and just gave it to the History Channel. Like, that's how you go $50 million in debt, and then the company disappears. Well, it is weird, because you hear now that the SEC wants to go back and investigate them. I think all you'll find is a bunch of intel fingerprints and no real trail leading to anybody. That's the nature of a black op in public. And they have lots of bobos to hang around and take the blame. One of the bobos in that case was DeLong, but Grush, they'll do the same thing with Grush, who already has his own documentary deals and all that stuff.
Is he really? I hadn't.
Oh yeah. And what's interesting too, good luck to you. It's not, what I don't like is the misleading of the public with false CIA propaganda. That's the danger here. There's nothing personal about it, but look, I'm going to put it this way, straight across, so you understand, because there's a lot of information that's going to come out. Investigative journalism at its heart is adversarial. There's no question about it, but it is not personal, and it can never be. But, I've used the example before. If you're dealing with a nuclear CEO who's dumping nuclear waste into a river, you're not going to go shoot baskets with them. This is very serious stuff. And if you're going to try for News Nation, and for the Patriot Act architect to run a UFO threat through the public, through the Congress, then you're going to get exposed. That's what's going to happen eventually. So, you know, it's going to be up to you. And if it's not, it's going to be a wave of information around that, because although we've been kind of a, an outpost here pointing this stuff out, let me tell you, a lot of people are very, very aware around this. And so that op in particular, which I think is so dangerous, if it gets momentum, and we've already seen, like the Bush woman who was a part of it earlier. I mean, look, this is what we're talking about. And any of those people are welcome to be on this program for a gentleman's debate. I've always pointed it out, from the top to the bottom. Any one of them can come on here. Yes, of course. In any normal situation, it would be. All right. What else you got?
He's a Death Star community. Does Cayce say anything about Swampington, D.C. falling into the sea? Can we hope?
No, as a matter of fact, Virginia is supposed to survive through all the Earth changes. And so I wonder, I think DC being so close there, that no, we don't have that. But what's interesting is up where I am here, in New England is supposed to see some big changes. And he says, watch Connecticut and the like. That's not something that's focused on very often. He has a very interesting dream where he is reincarnated in 2100 AD, and he's walking around, and they discover him as a child and realize that he's Edgar Cayce. And then these scientists are flying him around in these cigar-shaped ships. Now, this is way before the UFO wave. So think Cayce and the cigar-shaped ships. It's quite fascinating. So what happens is very interesting. They're flying him around, and they land in New York, and he's walking around, and it had been destroyed either by earthquake or war and was being rebuilt. Now, he's had a number of interesting experiences in New York, but it goes back to this turbaned figure from the Great White Brotherhood who showed up in his life over and over again. One of the interesting things that happened to him is he got arrested for practicing medicine without a license, and he just couldn't believe it. He'd had these difficulties and things. And what happened, this was associated with the Blumenthals and the people who had helped him. They were stockbrokers, and they loved his readings and stuff. At a certain point, they turned on him, and they set him up in this thing where he gave a reading. And then they were like, they knew that there was a statute there that you couldn't give a medical reading without a license and all this stuff. So he went to jail. And so he's coming out of it, and he's thinking, I'm going to get out of this. I'm not going to do any psychic readings ever again. Like, forget it. And he's walking down the street, and the figure shows up in the crowd with the turban on, and he's coming toward him. In case he's looking, and he can't believe it. And he looks around, and he realizes other people can see him for the first time. And everyone's looking at this turban figure walking towards Cayce. And then what does the figure do? The figure bows before Cayce, and he's on the ground. And here's the ascended master saying, now I bow to you. You've learned the lesson. You've been through the turmoil. Now I was your master there, giving you all this help over the years. And now here I'm bowing to you because you have overcome. And it gave Cayce the strength to do it. And what's interesting is somebody who was there, who witnessed it, said that Cayce had to be pulled out of the crowd because a huge crowd gathered, because it was such a weird scene of this Indian guru bowing before this, guy from Virginia Beach. Absolutely fascinating. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to wrap up our Edgar Cayce Says the 21st Century.
Really good questions I have to get to.
Okay, we're running real late. So real quick.
I know. Okay, let me hit this one. Okay. Raz said, was there not a Cayce reading or quote about the bear and the eagle joining to fight the dragon?
Yeah, there are some interesting ones that can be interpreted in certain ways. Certainly, he talked a lot about the friendship and cooperation between the United States and Russia over and over again. And this is very important, I think, because the whole thing about the hope of the world, which came up on a regular basis, also relates very much to this. But yeah, there are some interesting ones, and I'm going to leave off this episode with this. Now, remember, I was referring to the Armageddon thing, and then Olivia asked this very interesting question. Now, this is the Armageddon, as he calls it. And remember, that's the war in the air. Forget about the whole disaster thing. As there is the wavering of those that would enter as emissaries, as teachers from the throne of life, the throne of light, the throne of immortality, and wage war in the air with those of darkness. Then you'll know Armageddon is at hand, for with the great numbers of the gathering of the hosts of those that have hindered or would make for man and his weaknesses stumbling blocks, they shall wage war with the spirits of light that come into the earth for this awakening, that have been and are being called by those of the sons of men into the service of a living God. For as you have been told, he is not a God of the dead. And then he has a very unusual prediction. He said, who shall proclaim the acceptable year in him that has been born in the earth in America? Those from that land where there has been the regeneration not only of the body, but the mind and spirit of men, they shall come and declare that John Peniel is giving to the world a new order of things. Not that these have not been proclaimed or refused, but they shall be made plain in the minds of men, that they may know the truth and the light. Now, this is very interesting because I think later the whole thing about New World Order was adopted directly as kind of a misuse of what the mystery schools were bringing forward. But John Peniel, this is unusual. And then finally, again, back to the land rising piece. What are the world changes to come this year physically? And then he goes into looking over the future. Then he comes to something where he says the physical aspect of the west coast of America, there will be open waters then that appear in the northern portions of Greenland. There will be new lands seen off the Caribbean Sea. This is land rising, new lands. And dry land will appear. That's fascinating. There will be the falling away in India of much of the material suffering that has been brought to a troubled people. And then he goes into this question. They say, is America fulfilling her destiny? And it says, rather should the question be sought, my children, are individuals fulfilling those channels for which they have been brought through their own application for the knowledge within themselves to fulfill their position? For each and every one, each and every nation is led, even as in heaven. So he connects all that up with this discovery of the Hall of Records, and all these things sort of happen all together at some point here in the 21st century. And he's saying, if there is not the acceptance in America of the closer brotherhood of man, the love of the neighbor as self, civilization must wend its way westward, and again must Mongolia, must a hated people be raised. So there's a lot of interpretations around this, but we hear that over and over again, that if America doesn't take the mantle, then Eastern leadership will re-arise and it'll be a bad thing. That's the trick, which is America needs to fulfill its destiny. Finally, who will uncover the history of the past in record form that are said to be under the Sphinx in Egypt? Cayce responds, as was set in those records of the law of one in Atlantis, there would come three that would make of the perfect way of life. And as there is found those that have made in the experience from their sojourn in the earth a balance in their spiritual, mental, and material experience or existence, so may they become those channels through which there may be proclaimed a seeking, waiting, and desirous body, those things that have been preserved in the earth, those truths that have been so long proclaimed from the Atlanteans. That is something that we're on the precipice here. So you get a lot in the Cayce readings of these light emissaries coming in against this huge wave of darkness. That sounds to me a lot like anthroposophy and spiritual science and the dark astral Ahriman force. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're done.
Okay, I have a question about that. The thing that hit me was that led word, that a land is led, that a people are led. And it's really interesting because as an American, we're very individualistic people.
True.
And we don't think in those terms. What could you paint a picture based on Cayce's readings of what that would, if we were to be led to repent, to atone, if we could have a rebirth of the American spirit that would, it seems to me there's a reckoning going on globally, but certainly within America. What would we need to do to heal?
Well, I think what's interesting is that I feel like the people, let's start with America, but I think the people are more advanced, way more advanced than the leadership. And often they say, well, you get the leadership you deserve, but in this case, it seems like everywhere we look, the leadership is upside down. So we have a schizophrenic situation there where the leadership has been exposed to advanced levels of information, advanced levels of technology, but they haven't improved themselves. So they haven't become good leaders for humanity. And then on the public side, they haven't been given access to many of the discoveries in science and technology, whatever it happens to be. So we've been kept in this kind of a schizophrenic situation where they operate on their own and we're kind of underneath them. And now they've decided among themselves that they have the ability to centralize this system. And their great reset, that whole thing is all about the control from the top again. Forget about the American Revolution, and the French Revolution and all that stuff. We've figured out how to get around all that. We've got the technology. Let's go for it. The problem is, trying to get 7.5 billion, 8 billion people into that slave system, even with the technology you have, is a mighty, mighty task. But the inroads that they've made, that they've been emboldened by, and why they want this one world currency, which, by the way, Cayce talks about as well and says it will lead to a war if they do something like that. There's a balancing piece, which is they cut off from their spiritual development, relying completely on this Ahrimanic technology, and humanity in a half slumbering state, but also still with a conscience. And so many incredible people coming in to lead, that awakening. Now it happens within every person individually. And so I think in terms of leaders, we have some remarkable people stepping forward, and politically, people, for example, like RFK Jr. taking that chance, informing the public. We see signs of it everywhere. And there's an incredible across the board thing. The doctors who opposed the COVID op, the people pushing back against the UFO CIA op. There's a lot of things that are happening in succession that link with each other. And there's a lot of fantastic minds, incredible people to be brought to bear on this. So, no, I haven't given up by a long shot on the things that we can do. And if you know and you understand the nature of that mystery school information as a backdrop to that large mystery of the knowledge coming into humanity to move the culture forward, then there's a lot of good reason, to be positive about the future. No question about it. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been great to have you here. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, I've got a bunch of super chatters to thank. Lisa Davey, Boba the Clown, Gillenjoy R, Ira, Brian Paget, Eurythmy is Fun, Covita Maroney, Catherine Rorden, Wolfgang McCarthy, GDNPB, Peter Rabbit, Michael C., Happy Camper, Robert Scott, PJ Doe, Roper Overbearing, MTL Momzilla, Diane Mulligan, Bill Mayo, Erica Swenson Elliott, Roosevelt Media News, John Folden, Jay Parsons, Gooby Goo, Jenny Runco, Terry Doherty, Debbie McAdoo, Jennifer Walters, Center Universe, Brian Bernard, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, and Lou Dontole. Thank you so much for your generous super chats. Before I forget, two things. I wanted to say a very happy birthday to Karen Carpenter.
Hey.
And also, for those of you who don't know, Whitney Webb's baby boy is in the hospital, and so is asking for prayers. So please keep him and her whole family.
Oh, say a little prayer there. Yeah, incredible work that she does, and boy, we hope everything goes really well there. We will see you all next week, and one of the things I want to put across here in relation to Edgar Cayce, who's been really the figure that we've gone through on this, which is this is a guy who, when people would send him money for readings, would send the money back, and send them something saying, here's, do you understand the nature of what I do? And, I'll take this amount to help you with it, but don't send me any more. And, so the nature and the quality of Cayce's work, there's a reason why there's such an extensive legacy around him. And just that incredible ability demonstrated, real talent in the middle of all this. And, we see, thank God, people who are talented on the psychic front, but this is a real gifted position. And this is somebody who suffered a great deal of, even Christian condemnation, because they didn't understand the incredible marvels of the things that he could do. And in the period, in the era that he was in, for him to pull that off is just remarkable. So Edgar Cayce really changed that trajectory of history and gave us that story of Atlantis, which I think is now coming in full circle as we see the dangers of our own civilization on overdrive, and the importance of that Hall of Records being discovered now, more important than ever. And Cayce gave us the keys to that. Nobody had ever mentioned anything about it beforehand. There was never anything about, under the right paw of the Sphinx, there's a Hall of Records entrance to Atlantean information. For all the great stuff that had been there, Cayce came through with that remarkable piece. So we've been really, touching on the work of someone who did incredible, really miraculous things in his lifetime. And we're still learning so much about him. And I think he showed us also what we can do, because one of the things he said is, I don't do anything you can't do if you're willing to put in the effort. So it's making the right kind of effort. And I'll do a couple of shout outs tonight. What else have you got over there? You all set?
I'm all set.
Okay. Fantastic. Miss Olivia, great job tonight. Bravissimo.
Thank you.
Nicely
There's a
done.
lot of great questions I'm going to have to
We
have
will.
you look at.
We'll be back, as you know. Let's see. We've got...
Actually, I do want to ask you this
Giza,
question.
Najat. Wait, let me do a couple out here. Hold on. There's Najat. Yes, we can do. Max Lupo, have a good night. Michael Snow, Ivan Langley, Ray Story, Joseph. I don't know if Joseph's out there. It's great to have you here, sir. Scarlet Flyer. I like that. Stay free. Right, Terry said that. Interesting. Yeah, what do you got?
Roosevelt Media News said, totally evil people, how will the universe punish them? I would actually alter that wording and say, well, what did Cayce say about every jot and tittle, right? Needs to be...
That's a Bible piece.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like crossing all your I's and crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's.
You can't escape, right? It's every...
Well, that's the whole karma thing, isn't it? Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's very short-term fantasy on their part, but there are, like Ahriman, they're waiting and seeing what they can do in the great challenge of things. Cayce is watching. Isn't that interesting? Nick Malone steps up. I'm here late, Victoria Valone. Well, you can replay this show. It's available, and the chat will be up there as soon as I close out. It'll be up there in about 10 minutes. Fantastic. Let's see what we got here. Roosevelt News. It's great to see you out there, Roosevelt. Thank you. Roosevelt's been doing great work for years. And he's been out there giving us that support in the ideas room. Fantastic ideas room tonight. Salt of the Earth. Love wins. Be the best you and enjoy the ride. After all, that's really some of the greatest advice, the grand scheme of things. Brenda Fisher, great show. Be of good courage. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Sometimes I swear JFK Jr. is wearing an RFK Jr. mask. That's interesting. Great work. Thank you very much. Great ideas from great questions tonight. Do not comply. Yeah, that's important with all of the redux on the COVID op, of course. Do not comply. Christopher Knight. Prayers also for Maui residents. Yes, unbelievable. What an incredible challenge. Steiner, yeah, Dave Taylor. That's what whenever I see his books, that's what I say too.
We had
Steiner,
a few questions about timelines. I'm wondering, did Cayce ever discuss them?
We'll touch on that in a show about Cayce. But certainly there are possible futures depending on will. Absolutely. I don't think anyone has ever decided everything was laid out, but there's a kind of a destiny wave, isn't there, after all? Esther Taylor, Corey Anderson. What is that? Excellent research. Thank you, MG. Whew. What a great crowd out there tonight. Unbelievable. I'm trying to make sure I get everyone in here. Justin R. May 2040. Oh, that's a long ways off. Be a leader, not a follower. Hey-o. I agree with that. Ireland? Ireland says good night. Yes. Hello, Ireland. It's beautiful, beautiful place. Okay, everyone, we will see you all next week. What a great time I had spending it with you and Miss Olivia. Nicely done. We will be back with you on Friday, and we have some great interviews coming up for you. And of course, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends. So we'll see you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend, everyone.
Okay. God bless everybody.
Never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and certainly there can be again. What incredible things John Kennedy accomplished, and we're still learning about them. Just like with Cayce, these are extraordinary individuals, and I could spend all night talking about them. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
God bless.